wind in Blackwood was never just wind. It was a physical thing. A heavy hand made of grit and dry heat that slapped against the rough-hewn timber of the storefronts and stung the eyes of anyone foolish enough to look directly into the west. On this particular Tuesday in late August of 1884, the wind carried more than just the taste of sagebrush and alkaloid dust. It carried the sharp, copper scent of cruelty. Main Street was crowded, which was unusual for a weekday afternoon. Men had drifted out of the livery stables, the blacksmith's dark cavern, and the general store, drawn like flies to the spectacle set up outside the Gilded Horn Saloon. A makeshift platform had been erected there, nothing more than 2 whiskey barrels supporting a wide plank of warping pine, but it was high enough to serve its purpose. Mara stood on that plank, the rough wood digging into the soles of her bare feet. She kept her head down, her chin tucked against her chest, staring at the gray splinters of the wood beneath her toes. If she looked up, she would have to see them. She would have to see the sea of hats, the sweat-stained collars, the eyes that looked at her not as a woman, not as a mother, but as livestock to be appraised. She could feel their gazes anyway, crawling over her skin like insects. She tightened her arms around the small bundle pressed against her breast. The baby was sleeping. A small mercy that Mara prayed would last, wrapped in a threadbare gray blanket that had been washed until it was nearly translucent. The infant was the only warm thing in Mara's cold, hollow world. Barton Hale stepped up onto a crate beside the plank, towering over her. The owner of the Gilded Horn was a man of heavy appetites, his waistcoat strained across a paunch earned by drinking his own inventory. He smelled of stale beer and pomade, a sickly sweet scent that made bile rise in Mara's throat. "Gentlemen," Barton bellowed, his voice booming over the low murmur of the crowd and the barking of a stray dog near the water trough. "Gather round. We have a bit of business to settle today. A matter of unpaid debts." He gestured to Mara with a hand that wore a large, gaudy ring on the pinky finger. "You all know the situation. This girl here has been living under my roof, eating my food, and taking up space that could be used by paying customers. She has racked up a bill she cannot pay, and since the law in this territory respects the right of a man to collect what is owed, we are holding an auction to settle her account." Laughter rippled through the crowd. It was a low, ugly sound. "She does not look like she is worth much." "Barton," a voice called out from the front. A man with a face like tanned leather and a mouth full of missing teeth grinned up at her. "She is skinny as a rail." Barton chuckled, playing to his audience. "Lean meat cooks faster. Caleb. Besides, she is young. She has got years of work in her yet, scrubbing floors, mending clothes, or whatever else a man might need of an evening." The insinuation hung in the dry air, heavy and suffocating. Mara squeezed her eyes shut. She tried to retreat inside her own mind, to go to that white, silent place she had built for herself during the long nights in the room above the saloon. She tried to block out the whispers that were snaking through the crowd. "I heard she was one of the girls from over in Abilene before she came here," one man muttered to his neighbor. "Nah, she was a squatter's daughter," another argued. "Ran off when her PA got lung fever. Ended up here with no coin." "Does not matter where she came from," a third voice rasped. "Matters where she is going, and whose bastard she is holding." That was the question that seemed to interest them the most. The baby. Some said it was Barton's, though the saloon owner denied it with a laugh, saying he had better taste. Some said it belonged to a drifter who had passed through in the winter, leaving nothing behind but a swollen belly and an unpaid tab. The truth was locked inside Mara's heart, a secret she would carry to her grave. It did not matter who the father was. The child was hers. "Bidding starts at $20, Barton announced, wiping sweat from his forehead with a handkerchief. "That covers the food she stole and the room she occupied. $20 for a strong girl, barely 20 years of age." "Do I hear 20? It was a pitiful sum. A good horse cost 40, a saddle cost 30. Mara felt the shame burn her cheeks, hot and stinging. She was worth less than a saddle. 20, a voice called out. Mara risked a glance. It was a miner from the hills, a man with coal dust permanently etched into the lines of his face. He was looking at her hands, likely judging if they were strong enough to haul rock. 25, another man shouted. This one was older, dressed in a faded suit. The local undertaker who needed someone to wash bodies and scrub the pine boxes. The numbers floated in the air, disjointed and surreal. 30, 35, 40. Mara's arms began to tremble. The baby shifted in the blanket, letting out a small, mewling cry. The sound was thin, like a kitten in a storm, but it cut through the noise of the crowd. Barton frowned. He looked at the bundle in her arms with undisguised disgust. "Quiet that thing," he hissed at her, leaning close so only she could hear. "You are ruining the sale." "I cannot," Mara whispered, her voice cracking. It had been days since she had spoken to anyone who wasn't shouting at her. "She is hungry." Barton turned back to the crowd, his smile returning like a painted mask. "Don't mind the noise. Gentlemen, the brat comes with the package." "Unfortunately, but babies grow up. Or they don't. Either way, you get the girl." "I don't want another mouth to feed," a man near the back shouted. He was a ranch hand from the Double Bar, known for his heavy hand with horses and women. "I will give you 50 for the girl, but you keep the kid, drop it at the church, or leave it for the coyotes." Cruel laughter erupted again. The suggestion hung there, terrifyingly real. Mara's heart hammered against her ribs like a trapped bird. Panic, cold and sharp, pierced through her exhaustion. She stepped back, her heel catching on the edge of the plank. "No!" she gasped. Her voice was louder than she intended, shrill with terror. "No! You cannot take her!" Barton spun on her, his face darkening. "Shut your mouth, girl. You are property now. You don't get a say." "I will not go without her," Mara screamed, clutching the baby so tight the infant began to wail in earnest. "I will die first." The sheriff was standing by the hitching rail, leaning against a post with his thumbs hooked in his gun belt. He was a man named Miller, with a drooping mustache and eyes that looked perpetually tired. Mara looked at him, pleading silently. "Do something, please. You are the law. You are supposed to protect people." Miller shifted his weight, looked at the dust on his boots, and did nothing. He owed Barton money for whiskey, and in this town, debt was a stronger law than anything written in a book. "We can separate them," the ranch hand shouted again, stepping forward. He looked eager now, sensing blood in the water. "I will pay 60 for the girl alone." The crowd murmured. It was a better price. Barton looked at Mara, then at the crying baby, calculation narrowing his piggy eyes. 60 is a good offer, Barton mused aloud. Maybe we take the brat to the orphanage in Tucson, or maybe we just leave it here. Barton reached for the baby. His thick fingers closed around the edge of the blanket. Mara recoiled, twisting her body away. "Don't touch her." 70, a voice slurred. The crowd parted slightly. Stumbling forward was a man named Silas Vane. He was known in 3 counties and liked in none. A trapper by trade. He lived in a shack up near the timberline, coming down only to trade pelts for whiskey. He was filthy, his beard matted with grease, his eyes swimming in a haze of alcohol and malice. $70, Silas growled, spitting a stream of brown tobacco juice into the dirt. "For the girl and the kid, I need someone to skin rabbits, and when the kid gets big enough, she can skin them too." A chill went through the assembly. Even the rough men of Blackwood knew what happened to things that went up to Silas Vane's shack. They didn't come back down, or if they did, they were broken beyond repair. Barton hesitated, but greed won out. $70 was a fortune for a saloon girl with a debt. 70 going once, Barton called out, ignoring Mara's sobbing. "Please," Mara begged, her voice a broken whisper. "Please, God, no." 70 going twice. The air seemed to vanish from the street. Mara felt her knees giving way. She was going to faint. and when she woke up, she would be in hell. $150. The voice was not loud, but it cut through the shouting and the wind like a knife through canvas. It was a deep, resonant baritone, steady as a rock slide. The crowd fell instantly silent. Heads turned, men shifted aside, creating a wide path toward the back of the gathering. Standing there, near the edge of the boardwalk, was a man who looked like he had been carved out of the landscape itself. He was tall, standing a head above most of the townsfolk, with shoulders that filled out a dust-colored canvas coat. He wore a dark, wide-brimmed hat pulled low, shadowing his face, but it could not hide the scar. A jagged white line ran from his left cheekbone down to his jaw, disappearing into the collar of his shirt, a souvenir of a war that had ended 20 years ago but was still fighting itself out in men's souls. Luke Carver. He did not move like the other men. He did not shuffle or posture. He stood with a stillness that was unnerving, his hands hanging loose by his sides, nowhere near the heavy Colt revolver on his hip. Yet everyone knew how fast those hands could move. Barton blinked, squinting into the sun. "Luke," Barton asked, his voice losing its booming confidence. "You said 150? Luke Carver did not repeat himself. He simply walked forward. The crowd parted for him like water around a stone. He moved with a slow, deliberate gait, the sound of his spurs chiming softly in the sudden quiet. He stopped in front of the whiskey barrels. Up close, Mara could see his eyes. They were gray, the color of a storm cloud before the rain breaks, and they were utterly unreadable. He did not look at the crowd. He did not look at Barton. He looked straight at her. For a second, Mara stopped breathing. She saw no lust in those eyes. She saw no pity, either. She saw only a vast, terrifying emptiness, like an abandoned well. $150, Luke said again. He reached into his coat and pulled out a leather pouch. He upended it onto the barrel head. Gold coins and crumpled bills spilled out, shining and fluttering in the wind. It was more money than most men in Blackwood saw in a year. The town was stunned. Luke Carver lived alone on the high plains, miles from the nearest neighbor. He came to town once a month for supplies. He spoke to no one, drank with no one, and rode out before sunset. Rumors about him were as plentiful as sagebrush, that he had been a Confederate sharpshooter, that he had killed a dozen men in Kansas, that he had lost his mind in the silence of the prairie. Why would the silent rancher want a saloon girl and a newborn baby? Crazy, someone whispered. Got dark tastes, that one, another muttered. Always the quiet ones you have to watch. Barton stared at the money. His greed was warring with his confusion. But the gold was real. He licked his lips. Well now, Luke, Barton said, a nervous smile twitching beneath his mustache. That is a mighty fine offer. But seeing as there is such interest, maybe the price should be higher. Luke finally took his eyes off Mara and turned them on Barton. The temperature in the street seemed to drop 10 degrees. Luke didn't scowl. He didn't shout. He just looked at the saloon owner with a gaze so flat and deadly that Barton took an involuntary step back, nearly falling off his crate. Take the money. Hail, Luke said softly. Sign the paper. It wasn't a request. It was an instruction on how to stay alive. Barton swallowed hard. He scrambled for the pen and the inkwell sitting on the edge of the barrel. Sold, Barton squeaked. Sold to Luke Carver for $150. He scribbled his signature on the crude bill of sale he had drawn up that morning. The scratching of the nib was the only sound in the street. He pushed the paper toward Luke. Luke didn't even look at it. He scooped the paper up and shoved it into his pocket. Then he turned to Mara. She was trembling so hard she thought she might shake apart. This was it. This was the new owner. He had paid a fortune for her. That meant he expected things, terrible things, things that justified that kind of money. She clutched Grace. She had named the baby Grace in her mind, though she had never said it aloud, and backed away until her heels hung off the edge of the plank. Luke reached up. Mara flinched, squeezing her eyes shut, waiting for the grab, the rough pull, the claim of possession. But no hand touched her skin. Instead, a weight settled over her shoulders. It was heavy and warm and smelled of wood smoke, horses, and rain. She opened her eyes. Luke had taken off his canvas coat and draped it over her. It swallowed her small frame, hanging down to her knees, covering the thin, stained dress she wore. He stood there in his shirt sleeves, the wind whipping the fabric against his chest. He looked at her bare, bleeding feet, then back up to her face. "Can you walk?" he asked. His voice was low, meant only for her. Mara nodded dumbly. Her throat was too tight to speak. "The wagon is this way," he said. He did not grab her arm. He did not push her. He simply turned and began to walk back through the crowd, expecting her to follow. Mara hesitated for a heartbeat. She looked at Barton, who was busy counting the gold coins with shaking hands. She looked at the leering faces of the men who had bid on her. She looked at the sheriff, who was finally lighting a cigarette, relieved the trouble was over. She looked at Luke's broad back, moving away from her. She stepped down from the block. Her legs felt like water, but she forced them to move. She wrapped the giant coat tighter around herself and the baby, hiding them both from the world, and followed the silent rancher. The walk to the edge of town felt like a gauntlet. The whispers followed them. "Bought himself a whore. Look at him, acting like a savior. We know what he wants. Poor girl is better off with the wolves." Mara kept her eyes on the dust kicked up by Luke's boots. She focused on the rhythm of his stride. He walked with a slight limp, favoring his left leg, something she hadn't noticed when he was standing still. They reached a buckboard wagon parked near the blacksmith's shed. 2 roan horses, thick-necked and sturdy, were hitched to it. They stamped the ground, eager to be moving. Luke walked to the side of the wagon and turned to her. He held out his hands. Mara froze. The baby was between them. "Give her to me," Luke said, "just for a moment, so you can climb up." Mara's grip tightened. Every instinct in her screamed not to let go. Barton had tried to take her. The men had wanted to throw her away. Luke seemed to sense her terror. He didn't move his hands closer. He just waited, his patience like a deep root in the earth. "I am not going to drop her," he said, "and I am not going to keep her." There was a simple, brutal honesty in his tone. He wasn't trying to soothe her with sweet words. He was stating a fact. Slowly, with shaking arms, Mara extended the bundle. Luke took the baby. His hands were enormous, the knuckles scarred and rough, but he held the infant with a strange, awkward carefulness, as if he were holding a stick of dynamite that might go off. He didn't look at the baby's face. He looked at the horizon. Mara hiked up the hem of the coat and climbed onto the wooden bench seat of the wagon. Her body ached, her back, her hips, her feet. She settled onto the hard wood. Luke handed the baby back immediately. He didn't linger. He didn't brush her hand. He walked around the front of the wagon and climbed up to the driver's seat. The bench dipped under his weight. He was close enough that she could feel the heat coming off him, but he sat as far to the right as he could, leaving a distinct gap of space between them. He released the brake lever and gathered the reins. "Yeah," he grunted. The horses leaned into the harness. The wagon lurched forward, the iron-rimmed wheels grinding against the dirt. They rolled past the saloon. Mara did not look back. She stared straight ahead, past the horses' ears, toward the open prairie that stretched out endlessly to the west. Leaving Blackwood should have felt like freedom. It should have felt like a weight lifting. But as the town buildings gave way to shacks, and the shacks gave way to scrub brush and fence posts, Mara felt a different kind of heaviness settling in her chest. She was not free. She had just been traded. She glanced sideways at Luke. His profile was etched against the bright sky, sharp and unyielding. He had a strong nose, a heavy brow, and a mouth that looked like it had forgotten how to smile years ago. The scar on his jaw was white and puckered, pulling slightly at the skin. Who was this man? Why had he paid a king's ransom for a woman everyone else called trash? He hadn't spoken since they got on the wagon. He just drove, his eyes scanning the land, his body swaying with the rhythm of the road. Mara pulled the coat tighter. It was too big, but the warmth was seeping into her bones. She touched the fabric with her thumb. It was high-quality canvas, lined with wool. It was a coat meant to keep a man alive in a blizzard. She looked at the landscape opening up around them. The red dust of the road kicked up in plumes behind the wagon. The sky was a vast, blinding blue, broken only by the distant, jagged purple line of the mountains. It was beautiful, in a harsh, unforgiving way. But it was empty. There was no one out here. No sheriff, no neighbors, no witnesses. If he wanted to hurt her, no one would ever hear her scream. The thought made her stomach turn. She looked down at Grace, sleeping soundly now that the motion of the wagon was rocking her. I will kill him, Mara thought, the clarity of the idea surprising her. If he tries to hurt her, if he tries to hurt me, I will wait until he is asleep, and I will kill him. It was a dark, desperate thought, but it gave her a shred of power. She wasn't just a victim anymore. She was a mother, and mothers did what was necessary. Beside her, Luke Carver gripped the leather reins, feeling the tension radiating from the woman next to him. He could feel her fear. It was palpable, like static electricity in the air before a storm. He didn't blame her. He knew what she had been through, or at least he knew the shape of it. He had seen the way Barton looked at her. He had heard the things men said in town. He shifted his grip on the leather. His hands ached. They always ached when the weather changed or when he held them too tight. He hadn't planned on buying a woman today. He had come to town for flour, coffee, and nails. He had come to fix his barn roof. But then he had seen her on that block. He had seen the terror in her eyes, not the fear of death, but the fear of something worse. He had seen a human being, stripped of her humanity, piece by men who called themselves civilized. And he had remembered. He remembered the burning fields in Georgia. He remembered the screams of women in villages that were just collateral damage in a war of attrition. He remembered the promise he had made to himself when he buried his uniform and rode west, that he would never again stand by and watch the strong devour the weak. He risked a glance at her out of the corner of his eye. She was tiny, swallowed up in his coat. Her hair was matted with dust, her face streaked with dried tears. She looked like a bruised flower. But there was steel in her, too. He had heard it when she screamed at Barton. She fought for the child. He looked back at the road. The ruts were deep here. He had to be careful. He knew what the town thought. He knew what she probably thought. They thought he had bought himself a bed warmer, a servant, a plaything. Let them think it. It didn't matter. He made a silent vow then, as the wagon wheels crunched over the dry earth. He would give her a room. He would give her food. He would give her safety. But he would not touch her. Not ever. Not unless she asked him to. And he knew, with the certainty of a man who knows his own face in the mirror, that she never would. She was broken, and he was a man who knew only how to break things, not how to fix them. He was a soldier, a killer, a scarred ghost haunting his own land. He had no business with a wife, and certainly no business with a child. But he had the money, and he had the space, and he couldn't leave her there on that block. "We have a long ride?" Luke said suddenly, his voice startling them both. Mara jumped slightly. She looked at him, her eyes wide and wary. "How long?" she asked. 4 hours, Luke said. "We will be there by sundown." He didn't say anything else. He didn't ask her name, though he knew it was Mara. He didn't ask about the baby. He just drove, guiding the horses toward the mountains, toward the ranch that sat alone in the sea of grass, taking the woman and the child away from the hell they knew, and toward a future that neither of them could yet imagine. The wind kept blowing, erasing their tracks in the dust almost as soon as they were made, leaving no road back to who they were before. The wagon wheels ground against the hard-packed earth. a rhythmic crunching sound that vibrated through the wooden bench and straight into Mara's bones. Every rut, every stone, every shift in the terrain sent a jolt of pain through her exhausted body. She had given birth only 5 days ago, and the ache in her hips and back was a constant, throbbing reminder of her frailty. She clutched the bundle in her arms, shielding the baby's face from the relentless assault of the dust. It was everywhere. It rose in choking red clouds from the horse's hooves, coating her skin, settling in the creases of her eyelids, and grating like ground glass in her throat. This was not the dust of the town, which was mixed with sawdust and coal smoke. This was the ancient, elemental dust of the high plains, bitter with alkali and dry as old bones. Mara looked out at the passing landscape through squinted eyes. She had never been this far west of the settlement. To her, the world had ended at the edge of the boardwalks. Now, she saw the true face of the territory. It was vast, terrified, and indifferent. The sky was a pale, bleached blue, stretching tight over a land of sagebrush and cracked earth that seemed to go on forever. There were no trees, only the occasional twisted mesquite fighting for life in the dry wash. Beside her, Luke Carver was a statue carved from granite. He sat hunched forward slightly, his forearms resting on his thighs, the reins held loosely in his large, scarred hands. He did not look at her. He did not offer her water, though his own canteen hung from the buckboard seat. He simply drove, his eyes scanning the horizon with the predatory focus of a hawk. Mara studied his profile again, searching for a sign of the violence she knew must be simmering under that stoic surface. A man did not pay $150 for a woman just to let her sit in silence. He wanted something. They always wanted something. The heat radiating from his shoulder, inches from hers, felt dangerous. The baby stirred, letting out a thin, distressed wail. The dust was bothering her too. Mara rocked her gently, whispering a shushing sound that was lost in the wind. She felt a spike of panic. If the baby cried too much, would he get angry? Would he stop the wagon and leave the child by the road, as the men in town had suggested? She glanced at Luke, bracing herself for a shout. Luke turned his head slightly. He looked at the bundle, then at the horizon. "There is water in the canteen," he said. His voice was rough, unused to conversation. "Wet a rag, wipe her face." It was a command, but it was practical. Mara reached for the metal flask with trembling fingers. She uncorked it, poured a small amount onto the corner of the heavy coat he had given her, the only cloth she had, and dabbed it gently against the baby's forehead and lips. The infant settled, sucking greedily at the moisture on the wool. Luke turned his eyes back to the road. "We are almost there," he said. Almost there. The word sounded like a sentence. The sun began to dip low in the west, painting the sky in violent streaks of bruised purple and blood orange. The shadows stretched out long and thin across the grass, turning the sagebrush into strange, grasping shapes. Then Mara saw it. It sat in a shallow depression between two low rises, as if the land had reluctantly opened up to cradle it. The ranch. It was not the grand estate she had imagined a man with gold coins might own. It was a scar on the landscape. The house was a low, squat structure made of weathered timber that had been bleached gray by the sun. The roof was pitched steep against the snow, shingled with hand-split shakes that curled at the edges. A porch ran the length of the front, sagging slightly on the left side. Beyond the house stood a barn that leaned precariously into the prevailing wind, its wood dark with age. A corral fence, mended in a dozen places with wire and fresh pine, held a single cow and a black mare that lifted its head to whinny as the wagon approached. It was lonely. It was the loneliest place Mara had ever seen. There was no smoke from a neighbor's chimney, no sound of a church bell, no distant bark of a dog. There was only the wind, hissing through the grass, and the immense, crushing silence of the plains. But as the wagon rolled into the yard, Mara felt a strange sensation wash over her. It was quiet. There was no piano music clanging from a saloon. There were no shouting drunks. There was no smell of stale beer and unwashed bodies. Luke pulled back on the reins. Whoa! The wagon creaked to a halt in front of the house. The silence that followed was absolute. Luke set the brake and wrapped the reins around the lever. He climbed down, his boots thumping heavily in the dust. He walked around to her side of the wagon. Mara shrank back, clutching the baby. This was the moment. The arrival. The moment the owner took possession of his property. Luke stood by the wheel, looking up at her. His hat shadowed his eyes, but she could see the grim set of his mouth. You can get down, he said. Mara hesitated, her legs stiff and cramping. She shifted the baby to one arm and reached for the side of the wagon. She tried to step onto the wheel hub, but her bare foot slipped on the iron rim. She stumbled, a gasp escaping her lips as she pitched forward. Strong hands caught her. Luke had moved with startling speed. He gripped her by the waist, his hands encompassing her rib cage almost entirely. For a second, she was suspended in the air, held against his chest. She could smell him, sweat, leather, and the faint, metallic scent of gun oil. She felt the hard wall of his body, the power in his arms. She went rigid, waiting for the squeeze, the grope, the cruelty. Luke set her gently on the ground and immediately stepped back. He released her as if she were made of hot iron. Go inside, he said, gesturing toward the dark door of the house. I will see to the horses. Mara stood there, swaying slightly, feeling the solid earth beneath her feet. She looked at him, confused by his retreat. He was turning away, attending to the animals with more focus than he had shown her. She turned and walked up the wooden steps of the porch. The boards creaked under her weight. She pushed open the heavy oak door and stepped into the gloom. The interior of the house was cool and smelled of pine resin and coffee. It took a moment for her eyes to adjust. It was one large room, serving as a kitchen and living area. A cast-iron stove sat in the corner, cold and black. A rough-hewn table with two mismatched chairs stood in the center. There were no curtains on the windows, only wooden shutters. The floor was swept clean, the wood worn smooth by boot leather. To the right, there was a doorway leading to a back room. Mara walked toward it, her heart hammering. This would be his room, the place where... She stopped in the doorway. It was a small room, bare and simple. There was a narrow iron bed pushed against the far wall, covered with a heavy quilt. A washstand with a chipped pitcher stood near the window. But it was what stood beside the bed that made Mara's breath catch in her throat. A cradle. It was made of pine, the wood pale and fresh. It had been sanded smooth, the edges rounded with painstaking care so there were no splinters. The rockers were perfectly balanced. Inside lay a small mattress stuffed with fresh straw and covered with a piece of soft flannel. Mara stared at it, her mind reeling. He lived alone. He was a bachelor rancher with a reputation for silence and solitude. Why did he have a cradle? He had not bought it in town today. The wood had darkened slightly. It had been made months ago. Someone built this, she whispered to the empty room. She walked over and touched the smooth rail of the cradle. It was sturdy. It was safe. It was waiting. A sound behind her made her jump. Luke was standing in the doorway, carrying 2 saddlebags and a sack of flour. He looked at her, then at the cradle, and a strange, unreadable expression crossed his face. Something like shame, or perhaps defensiveness. He looked away quickly, setting the supplies down on the floor. It was for a nephew, he muttered, the lie clumsy and thick in the air. Who never came to visit? He didn't wait for her to respond. He turned back to the main room. I will boil water, he said, and find you something to eat. Mara laid the baby gently in the cradle. It was a perfect fit. For the first time in 5 days, her arms were empty. She felt a phantom weight against her chest, but also a relief so profound her knees nearly buckled. She walked back into the main room. Luke was at the stove, shoving kindling into the firebox. His movements were efficient, practiced. He lit a match, the sulfur flare brief and bright, and got the fire catching. He moved around the kitchen, filling a kettle from a bucket, pulling a loaf of bread and a piece of dried beef from a cupboard. He set them on the table. He didn't look at her. Mara stood by the wall, wrapping her arms around herself. She was wearing his coat still. Underneath, her dress was torn and dirty. She felt filthy. She felt like an intruder in this quiet, ordered life. "The water will be hot soon," Luke said, staring at the kettle. "There are linens in the trunk by the window. Clean ones. You can wash." He was doing everything except telling her what he wanted. The tension was unbearable. Mara had lived her life in the transactional world of the saloon. You paid for whiskey. You got whiskey. You paid for a woman. You got a woman. The silence, the kindness. It was a trick. It had to be. He was softening her up. Or perhaps he enjoyed the fear, the anticipation. She took a step forward, her voice trembling. "Mr. Carver." Luke stiffened. He turned slowly to face her. "Luke," he corrected. "Just Luke." "Luke," she repeated, testing the name. She took a deep breath, forcing herself to say the words she had been rehearsing since the auction block. I know you paid a lot of money. I know what that money buys." She reached for the buttons of the coat. Her fingers were clumsy with fatigue. "I am tired, and I am still bleeding some," she said, her voice dropping to a whisper of shame. "But I will do what I can. I know my place. I just ask, please be gentle, and do not wake the baby." She let the coat slide off one shoulder. Luke looked at her. His face went pale, the scar on his jaw standing out in stark white relief. His eyes widened, not with lust, but with something that looked like horror. "Stop," he said. The word was a sharp crack in the quiet room. Mara froze, the coat half off. Luke took a step toward her. His hands balled into fists at his sides, as if he were fighting the urge to hit something, or perhaps to stop himself from reaching out. "Is that what you think this is?" he asked, his voice low and vibrating with intensity. Mara looked at him, confused tears stinging her eyes. "You bought me," she said. "You paid Barton. I am yours. That is how it works." "No," Luke growled. He turned away, pacing a short circle in the small kitchen. He ran a hand over his face, dragging his fingers through the grit on his skin. He stopped and looked at her again. The anger was gone, replaced by a weary sadness. "I did not buy you to use you, Mara. I bought you to get you off that block." He pointed a finger at the door, toward the east, toward the town. "I saw what they were doing. I saw what they were going to do. And I had the money. That is all." He took a breath, his chest heaving under his dusty shirt. "You are not property here. You are a woman who needed a place to be. This is a ranch. There is work to be done. If you want to cook, you cook. If you want to mend, you mend. But anything else, any agreement between us?" He looked her dead in the eye, his gaze steady and fierce. "That will be a choice. Your choice. Not something Barton Hale wrote on a piece of paper. Do you understand me?" Mara stared at him. She heard the words, but she couldn't make them fit the world she knew. A man who paid a fortune for nothing in return. A man who had the power to take but chose not to. "I don't understand," she whispered. "Why?" Luke looked at the floor. He seemed to shrink slightly, the broad shoulders rounding. "Because," he said softly, "no one should be sold." He grabbed his hat from the peg by the door. "I will sleep in the barn tonight," he said. "The bed is yours. Lock the door if it makes you feel safer." He walked out into the gathering dark, closing the door firmly behind him. Mara stood alone in the center of the room. The kettle began to whistle on the stove. She pulled the coat back up onto her shoulders and sank into one of the chairs, burying her face in her hands. She didn't cry. She was too stunned to cry. She just sat there, listening to the fire crackle, trying to believe that the door was truly closed, and that for the first time in years. She was the one on the inside. Night on the high plains was not silent. It was a living thing. Mara lay in the narrow iron bed, the clean linens rough but smelling of sunshine and soap. The darkness in the room was absolute, save for a sliver of moonlight cutting through the shutter slats. Outside, the wind had picked up. It howled around the corners of the house, rattling the shingles and whistling through the gaps in the logs. It sounded like a pack of wolves trying to claw their way in. And then there were the coyotes. Their yips and howls rose from the darkness, a maniacal chorus of laughter and screams that made the hair on Mara's arms stand up. They sounded close, too close. She reached out and touched the cradle. She could hear the soft, rhythmic breathing of Grace. The baby was the only anchor she had in this sea of strange noises. Mara stared up at the ceiling she couldn't see. She was warm. Her stomach was full of the bread and beef Luke had left. But sleep would not come. She thought of Luke out in the barn. Was he cold? Was he regretting his charity? Or was he lying there making plans for when her guard was down? She couldn't trust it. Trust got you hurt. Trust got you pregnant and abandoned. Trust got you sold. But she remembered the look on his face when she had offered herself. The horror, the anger. Not at her, but at the idea of it. No one should be sold. She closed her eyes, listening to the wind battering the fragile walls of the house. It felt like they were on a raft in the middle of a violent ocean. Just her, the baby, and the silent man in the barn. The morning sun was blinding. It poured through the cracks in the shutters, slicing across the floor in bars of gold. Mara woke with a start. The baby was crying. She tried to sit up, but her body rebelled. A wave of dizziness washed over her, and her legs felt like lead. The exhaustion of the auction, the travel, and the trauma of the birth had finally caught up with her. She fell back against the pillow, gasping. The door to the bedroom creaked open. Mara flinched, pulling the quilt up to her chin. Luke stood there. He had already been up for hours. She could smell the coffee and the fresh hay on his clothes. "I heard her," he said, nodding toward the cradle. He didn't come closer to the bed. He walked to the cradle and looked down. "She is wet," he observed. I will get up," Mara said, forcing herself to push back the covers. She swung her legs over the edge of the bed, but as soon as her feet hit the floor, the room spun. She gripped the mattress, her knuckles white. "Stay down," Luke said. His voice was sharp with concern. He reached into the cradle. Mara watched, helpless, as his giant hands slid under the tiny, squalling infant. He lifted Grace up. He looked terrified. The baby was so small against his chest, her head bobbing slightly until he cupped it with a palm the size of a dinner plate. "I will take her," he said. "I found the cloths in your bag." He backed out of the room, carrying the baby as if she were made of spun glass. Mara lay back, panting. She listened. She heard the splash of water. She heard Luke murmuring, low, rumble tones that had no words. She heard the rustle of fabric. Then, silence. She dragged herself out of bed 10 minutes later, driven by a mother's instinct. She wrapped the blanket around herself and walked on trembling legs to the front door. She opened it a crack. Luke was sitting on the porch steps, bathed in the morning light. He had the baby propped against his shoulder, his large hand rubbing her back in slow, rhythmic circles. He was looking out at the fields, where the mist was rising off the grass. Grace was asleep. Mara watched him. She saw the way his chin rested gently near the baby's head. She saw the way his shoulders, usually so tense and high, had dropped. He wasn't looking at the baby with disgust. He wasn't looking at her as a burden. He was holding her with a quiet, reverent solemnity. Something inside Mara shifted. It was a physical sensation, like a knot loosening in her chest. For years, she had seen men look at children as mistakes, or as expenses, or as chains. Luke looked at Grace like she was a person. Mara leaned against the doorframe, her eyes burning. She didn't go out. She let him have the moment. She let herself believe, just for a second, that maybe this place wasn't a prison. The days fell into a pattern. The routine was the medicine Mara didn't know she needed. As her strength returned, she began to take over the house. It was a slow conquest. First, she swept the corners that Luke had ignored for years. Then she organized the pantry. Then she took on the washing. Work was safe. Work meant you had a purpose. If she was useful, she reasoned, he wouldn't throw her out. She learned the rhythms of the ranch. Luke rose before dawn. He made coffee, black, thick as mud, and drank 2 cups standing up. He left for the chores, feeding the stock, mending fence, clearing the irrigation ditch. Mara took care of the chickens. She liked the hens. They were busy and foolish and harmless. She gathered the brown eggs, warm and smooth, carrying them in her apron. She hauled water from the pump in the yard, her arms growing stronger, the sun browning her pale skin. She washed Luke's shirts, scrubbing the sweat and dirt from the heavy cotton, hanging them on the line to flap in the relentless wind like surrender flags. They didn't talk much. Meals were eaten in silence, but the tension had changed. It wasn't the fearful silence of the first day. It was a companionable silence, born of exhaustion and shared space. Luke was always polite. He said please and thank you. He never entered the house without knocking the dirt off his boots. He never touched her, but his eyes followed her. She felt them when she was at the stove, or when she was nursing Grace by the window. He would watch her, and then look away quickly when she turned. It wasn't a predatory look. It was a look of confusion, as if he couldn't quite figure out how she had ended up in his kitchen, and didn't know what to do with the fact that he was glad she was there. The storm came in late September, rolling down from the Rockies like a black bruise spreading across the sky. It started in the afternoon, the air turning thick and electric. The birds stopped singing. The wind died, leaving a heavy, suffocating stillness. Luke came in early from the fields. He looked worried. "Big one coming," he said, taking off his hat. He moved around the room, checking the shutters, barring the door. When it hit, it was with the force of a hammer. Thunder shook the floorboards beneath Mara's feet. Rain lashed against the house, sounding like handfuls of gravel being thrown by an angry giant. Mara sat in the rocking chair, clutching Grace. Every crack of thunder made the baby jump and whimper. Then came the drip. A dark spot appeared on the ceiling above the cradle, spreading rapidly. A drop fell, hitting the floor with a wet plap. Then another. The roof. Luke cursed. He grabbed a bucket and placed it under the leak. But the wind was tearing at the shingles. Another leak sprung over the table, then another near the stove. The house, so solid in the sun, felt flimsy and small against the rage of the storm. A flash of lightning lit up the room, blindingly white, followed instantly by a crash that rattled the dishes on the shelves. Mara let out a cry. She curled over the baby, burying her face in the blanket. The fear she had been holding at bay, the fear of the auction, of Barton, of the unknown future, came rushing back. She felt exposed. The walls were paper. The world was trying to get in to crush them. Luke was there. He didn't touch her. He brought the lantern and set it on the floor beside the chair. He sat down on the rug, his back against the wall, placing himself between her and the door, between her and the storm. "It is just noise." "Mara," he said, his voice steady and low, cutting through the panic. "The house has stood for 10 years. It will stand tonight." Mara looked at him. The lantern light cast deep shadows on his face, highlighting the scar. "I am scared," she whispered, the confession tearing out of her, not of the storm. Luke looked at her, his gray eyes softening. "I know," he said. "I am scared that this is a dream," she said, rocking faster. "I am scared that tomorrow Barton will come, or that you will change your mind, or that I am too broken to ever be right again." She was crying now, silent tears tracking through the dust on her cheeks. "They hurt me. Luke, they took everything I was and they sold it. How do you come back from that?" Luke looked down at his hands. He turned them over, looking at the calluses, the scars. "You don't," he said quietly. "You don't come back. You just go on." He looked up at her. "I was at Shiloh," he said, "and Antietam." It was the first time he had spoken of his past. "I saw boys die in the mud calling for their mothers. I saw men do things to other men that made me wonder if God had left the earth entirely." He paused, the memory dark in his eyes. "When I came home, I couldn't stand the noise of people. I couldn't stand the lies they told themselves about honor and glory. I came out here to be alone, to forget." He leaned his head back against the wall. "I made a promise. Mara. After the war, I promised I would never be another man who breaks things. I promised I would never use my strength to take from someone weaker." He looked at her, and the intensity of his gaze burned her. "You are safe here. As long as I have breath in my body, no one will touch you. Not Barton, not anyone, and not me." Mara looked at him, seeing the war in his face, the grief he carried like a heavy pack. He was broken too, just like her. Another crack of thunder shook the house. The leak above the cradle suddenly turned into a steady stream. Water splashed onto the bedding. "The roof is going," Luke said, standing up. "We cannot stay in here. It is too wet." "Where?" Mara asked, clutching Grace. "The bedroom," he said. "The wind is hitting the east side. The bedroom is on the west. It will be dry." He led her into the small back room. It was dark, but dry. The storm raged outside, but the noise was muffled here. There was only the one narrow bed. Mara looked at it, then at Luke. Luke hesitated. "I will sleep on the floor." "No," Mara said. Her voice surprised her. It was firm. "The floor is drafty. You will get sick, and I do not want to be alone." She sat on the edge of the bed, placing Grace in the center, a tiny barrier between the pillows. "Please," she said, "just sleep." Luke looked at her for a long moment. Then, slowly, he unbuckled his gun belt and hung it on the bedpost. He took off his boots. He lay down on the far side of the mattress, his back stiff, his body rigid. He was as close to the edge as he could get without falling off. Mara lay down on her side. The baby was between them. She could feel the warmth radiating from him. It was a solid, steady heat. She could hear his breathing, slow and controlled. Outside, the world was ending in wind and rain. Inside, in the small, dark room, there was a bubble of safety. Mara closed her eyes. For the first time, she became aware of the scent of him, not just sweat, but something deeper, something earthy and masculine. A feeling stirred in her belly. It wasn't fear, it was a strange, aching pull. She wanted to scoot closer. She wanted to feel that warmth against her own cold skin. She wanted to know what it felt like to be held by arms that promised protection, not possession. The thought terrified her. She was a ruined woman. She had no right to want, and he had promised not to touch her. She squeezed her eyes shut, guilt washing over her. "He is a good man," she told herself. "Don't ruin it. Don't make it dirty." Beside her, Luke stared into the dark. He could smell the lavender soap she had used on her hair. He could hear the soft catch of her breath. Every instinct in his body was screaming at him. He was a man who had been alone for a decade. The presence of a woman, this woman, with her fierce eyes and her gentle hands, was torture. He wanted to turn over. He wanted to wrap his arms around her and the child and hold them until the storm passed. But he remembered the auction block. He remembered her flinching when he offered his coat. He clenched his jaw until it ached. He would not move. He would not cross that line. He would be the wall she needed, even if it killed him. He lay still, listening to the rain, choosing her trust over his own desperate need, while the space between them crackled with the things they were both too afraid to say, The seasons on the high plains did not turn gently. They broke. The bitter, bone-deep cold that had lingered after the storm finally cracked, giving way to days of brilliant, blinding sunshine and air so dry it felt like breathing crushed glass. The mud in the yard turned to hard-packed earth, and the grass, though yellowed and brittle, stood tall against the constant wind. Mara changed with the land. The hollows in her cheeks began to fill, her skin losing the translucent gray of the auction block and taking on a dusting of gold from the sun. She moved differently now. The shuffle of a prisoner was gone, replaced by the purposeful stride of a woman with work to do. She carried Grace in a sling made from a cut-up flour sack, the baby bound tight against her chest, her small heartbeat a second rhythm to Mara's own. She was no longer a guest in Luke's house. She was a part of its machinery. But Luke seemed determined that she be more than just a housekeeper. "We are miles from anyone," he told her one morning, setting a heavy Winchester rifle on the porch rail. "If I am out on the range and something happens, a coyote, a snake, a man, you need to know how to answer it." He taught her with a patience that unnerved her. He showed her how to saddle the roan mare, his large hands guiding hers over the latigo, teaching her how to check the cinch so the saddle wouldn't slip. He taught her to read the clouds, pointing out the difference between the wispy tails of wind clouds and the bruising purple of a coming hailstorm. And he taught her to shoot. It was a Tuesday afternoon, the sun high and fierce. They stood behind the barn, a tin can set up on a fence post 50 yards away. "Keep your feet shoulder-width apart," Luke instructed, his voice low. Mara hefted the rifle. It was heavy, the walnut stock warm from the sun. She raised it to her shoulder, but the barrel wavered. Her arms were strong from hauling water, but the weapon felt alien, a tool of violence that she had always been on the wrong end of. "You are leaning back," Luke said. "You have to lean into it. Let the wood become a part of your bone." He stepped closer. For weeks, they had danced around each other, maintaining a respectful distance of 2 feet, the length of a table, the width of a doorway. Now, that distance vanished. Luke moved behind her. She could feel the heat of his body along the length of her back, a solid wall of presence. He reached around, his left hand covering her left hand on the barrel, his right hand gently pressing against her elbow to lift it. "Like this," he murmured. His breath ghosted over the shell of her ear. The scent of him enveloped her. Tobacco, saddle soap, and the salt of honest sweat. It was not a bad smell. It was intoxicating. Mara's breath hitched in her throat. The world narrowed down to the point where his chest brushed her shoulder blades. She could feel the slow, heavy thud of his heart against her back. "Relax your shoulder," he said, his voice dropping an octave, vibrating through her. "Squeeze the trigger. Do not pull it. Just a breath. And then—" His hand tightened over hers, guiding the aim. A tremor went through Mara. It started in her stomach and flashed downward, a sudden, sharp ache of desire that shocked her. It wasn't fear. It was a hunger she hadn't felt in years, perhaps never like this. It was a need to lean back, to let him take the weight of the rifle, the weight of the baby, the weight of her life. She realized, with terrifying clarity, that she wanted him to wrap those arms around her for real. The thought panicked her. She was a woman bought for a debt. She was damaged goods. She had no right to feel this heat for a man who had done nothing but offer her charity. She gasped and pulled away, the barrel of the rifle jerking downward violently. "No!" she blurted out, stepping sideways, nearly dropping the weapon in the dust. Luke flinched as if he had been slapped. He stepped back instantly, raising his hands, his face draining of color. The scar on his jaw stood out stark and white. "I apologize," he said quickly, his voice rough. "I did not mean to crowd you. I forgot myself." He thought she was afraid of him. He thought she was recoiling from a man's touch because it reminded her of Barton, or the others. Mara opened her mouth to tell him the truth. "I am not scared of you. I am scared of how much I want you." But the words died in her throat. The shame was too old, too deep. How could she tell this stoic, honorable man that the woman he rescued was thinking of him in his bed? "It is fine," she whispered, clutching the rifle against her chest like a shield. I am not used to it." "We will stop for today," Luke said. He turned away, pulling his hat low to hide his eyes. The air between them, usually easy and quiet, was now thick with unsaid things, charged and awkward. The supplies ran low 2 weeks later. The flour barrel was just dust at the bottom, and they were out of coffee. A trip to town was unavoidable. "We will go in the morning," Luke announced at dinner, staring at his plate. Mara felt a cold knot form in her stomach. Town meant eyes. Town meant memories. Town meant being reminded of what she was. "I can stay here," she suggested weakly. "No," Luke said. "It is not safe alone. And Grace needs things. She is growing out of that blanket." The ride the next morning was long and stifling. The dust seemed to have a malice to it, coating everything in a fine red layer. Mara sat on the buckboard seat, wrapped in a heavy gray shawl despite the heat. She pulled it forward like a hood, hiding her face, hiding the baby. She felt like a criminal returning to the scene of a crime. Luke drove in silence. He seemed tighter than usual, his eyes scanning the horizon, his hand never far from the revolver at his hip. When the buildings of Blackwood appeared on the horizon, shabby, leaning wooden structures that looked like they had been dropped from the sky, Mara felt a physical wave of nausea. They rolled down Main Street. It was busy, just as it had been on the day of the auction. As the wagon creaked past the saloon, the conversation on the boardwalks died. Heads turned. Mara kept her eyes on her hands, but she could feel the weight of the stairs. They were heavy, sticky things. "Look who is back!" a woman whispered loud enough to be heard. "The Carver fellow and his purchase," a man chuckled. Luke did not look left or right. He drove straight to the hitching rail in front of the general store and pulled the horses up. "Stay close to me," he said quietly as he helped her down. They entered the store. It smelled of pickle brine, peppermint, and dry goods. Mr. Abernathy, the proprietor, was behind the counter. He nodded to Luke, his expression carefully neutral, but his eyes darted to Mara with a mixture of curiosity and disdain. "I need 50 pounds of flour, 10 of sugar, and 5 of coffee," Luke said, his voice filling the room. "And nails, 4 penny." Mara drifted toward the back, where the bolts of fabric and household goods were kept. She needed flannel for diapers. Mrs. Abernathy was there, stacking tins of peaches. She was a stout woman with a face like a dried apple. She looked up as Mara approached, and her mouth tightened into a thin, hard line. She took a distinct step back, pulling her skirts away as if Mara were contagious. Mara froze, her hand hovering over a bolt of blue calico. The rejection stung, sharp and familiar. She lowered her head, ready to retreat. But then Grace woke up. The baby shifted in the sling and let out a soft, gurgling coo, reaching a tiny, dimpled hand out toward the bright label of a peach tin. "Mrs. Abernathy blinked. She looked at the baby. The hardness in her eyes wavered. She looked at Mara, really looked at her, and saw not a saloon girl, but a young mother with tired eyes and a protective hand over her child's head. Is she healthy, Mrs.? Abernathy asked, her voice stiff but not unkind. "Yes, ma'am," Mara whispered. "She is strong." "Mrs." Abernathy sighed, a sound of resignation. She reached under the counter and pulled out a folded square of knitted wool. It was a pale yellow, worn but clean. "My youngest outgrew this years ago," the woman said, shoving it into Mara's hands. "It is no good to me sitting in a box. Take it." Mara stared at the blanket. "Thank you," she choked out. "The child deserves better than this town gave her mother." "Mrs." Abernathy muttered, turning back to her peaches. "Go on now. Your man is waiting." "Your man," The words echoed in Mara's head as she walked back to the front. They loaded the wagon in silence. Luke carried the heavy sacks with ease, his back broad and capable. Mara climbed up, clutching the yellow blanket, feeling a tiny fissure in the wall of shame she had built around herself. Luke was unhitching the horses when the saloon doors swung open. 3 men stumbled out, bringing the smell of stale whiskey and aggressive laughter with them. One of them, a wiry man with red hair and a face pockmarked from smallpox, stopped dead when he saw the wagon. "Well, I will be damned," the man slurred, "if it isn't the Silent Saint." It was a ranch hand named Jeb, a man who had been a regular at Barton's. He had tried to buy Mara once for an hour, and she had bitten his hand. Jeb staggered off the boardwalk, navigating the dust toward them. "And he still has the girl," Jeb laughed, gesturing loosely at Mara. "Hey there, darling. You're looking a little plumper. The ranch life must suit you." Luke ignored him. "Get in the wagon, Mara," he said, not looking at Jeb. "Oh, don't be rude." "Luke," Jeb sneered. Stepping closer, he grabbed the bridle of the near horse, stopping them from leaving. "You know, some of the boys were saying you were crazy to pay that much. But looking at her now, maybe you are smarter than you look." Jeb's eyes raked over Mara, stripping her bare. "Say, Carver, you must be tired of her by now. How about you lend her out? I've got $5. That should cover 10 minutes, right? Just for old time's sake." The world seemed to stop. Mara stopped breathing. The shame was a hot iron branding her chest. Luke went very still. He finished tying the canvas cover over the supplies. Then, with terrifying slowness, he turned around. "Let go of the horse," Luke said. His voice was not loud. It was the sound of a shovel hitting a grave. Jeb laughed, emboldened by the whiskey and his friends watching from the porch. "Or what? You gonna preach at me? Come on, share the wealth. She is just a whore. Carver, she is community property." Luke moved. It happened so fast Mara barely saw it. One moment Luke was standing by the wheel. The next, he had crossed the space between them. He didn't punch Jeb. He grabbed him by the throat with his left hand and slammed him backward against the rough-hewn post of the hitching rail. The sound of the impact was sickening, a heavy thud of bone on wood. Jeb's eyes bulged. He clawed at Luke's hand, but Luke didn't budge. He pinned the man there, lifting him until his boots scrabbled in the dirt. Luke leaned in close, his face inches from the terrified drunk. "You will listen to me," Luke snarled, his voice trembling with a rage so profound it shook the air. "And you will listen good. She is not a whore. She is a free woman, and she is with me." He tightened his grip. Jeb gagged, his face turning purple. "If you ever speak to her again," Luke whispered, deadly and cold, "if you ever even look at her, I will not come for you with words. I will bury you where you stand. Do you understand?" Jeb nodded frantically, choking. Luke held him for a second longer, letting the terror sink in, then threw him to the ground like a sack of garbage. Jeb scrambled backward in the dust, gasping for air, clutching his throat. His friends on the porch didn't move. They had seen the look in Luke Carver's eyes, and they wanted no part of it. Luke turned back to the wagon. He didn't look at the crowd. He climbed up, released the brake, and snapped the reins. Yeah, they rode out of town at a trot, leaving the stunned silence of Blackwood behind them. For the first mile, neither of them spoke. Mara was shaking. She looked at Luke's hands on the reins. The knuckles were white. He was breathing hard through his nose, his jaw locked tight. He hadn't fought for his property. He hadn't fought because Jeb insulted him. He had fought for her name. He had called her a free woman. Tears pricked Mara's eyes, hot and fast. She reached out and touched his sleeve. "Luke," she whispered. He didn't look at her, but his shoulders hunched up as if defending against a blow. "I am sorry you had to hear that," he said gruffly. "No," Mara said, her voice cracked. "Thank you." He glanced at her then. "Thank you for stopping him, for what you said. No one has ever—" She couldn't finish. No one had ever stood between her and the world before. No one had ever claimed she was worth defending. Luke looked back at the road. He had no right. He said simply, the tension in the wagon broke, replaced by something warmer, something that felt like the sun coming out after a long winter. Mara scooted just an inch closer to him on the seat. This time, he didn't pull away. They arrived back at the ranch at twilight. The sky was a bruised purple, the first stars appearing like pinpricks in a dark curtain. They unloaded the supplies in a companionable rhythm, the earlier violence fading into the quiet peace of the homestead. After Grace was fed and asleep in the cradle, Mara went out to the pump to wash the dust from her face. She stopped when she saw Luke. He was standing by the horse trough, stripped to the waist. He had pumped a bucket of water and was sluicing it over his head and shoulders, washing away the town. The moonlight turned his wet skin to silver. Mara stood in the shadow of the porch, unable to look away. He was beautiful, in a rugged, carved stone way. Broad shoulders, thick muscles that corded when he moved. But then he turned, and she saw his back. She gasped softly. His back was a map of pain. There were old, white, puckered scars from bullets, but over them lay the raised, ugly welts of a whip, crisscrossing his skin like a spiderweb of violence. And on his shoulder, a burn mark, smooth and shiny. He wasn't just a soldier. He had been a prisoner. He had been tortured. Luke heard her gasp. He spun around, water flying from his hair, reaching for his shirt on the fence post to cover himself. But he was too late. He saw that she had seen. He froze, clutching the wet shirt, shame darkening his eyes. I didn't know you were there," he said tightly. Mara didn't retreat. She stepped off the porch and walked toward him. The fear she had felt during the shooting lesson was gone, replaced by a profound, aching sorrow for him. He carried his own ruins. He knew exactly what it felt like to be broken by other men. She stopped in front of him. He looked ready to bolt, his muscles tense. "Luke," she said softly. She reached out. This time, her hand didn't tremble. She placed her fingertips lightly on the jagged scar running down his left shoulder. His skin jerked under her touch, but he didn't pull away. He squeezed his eyes shut, his breath hissing out between his teeth. "Andersonville," he whispered, the name of the prison camp hanging in the air like a curse. And then, he opened his eyes and looked at her, and the vulnerability in his gaze broke her heart. "They look ugly," he said harshly. "No," Mara said. She moved her hand, tracing the line of the scar down to his chest. "They look like you survived." She looked up into his face. I thought you were made of stone," she confessed. "I thought you saved me because you were strong and I was weak." Luke shook his head. "I am not strong, Mara. I am just quiet. The war took the noise out of me. It took the belief that I was a good man." He looked at her hand on his chest, then covered it with his own large, rough palm. "When I saw you on that block, I saw myself, helpless, waiting for the blow." Mara stepped closer. The heat of his body was a magnet. "I am ruined. Luke," she whispered, the old fear surfacing one last time. "You heard Jeb. You know what people say. I've been with men who didn't care my name. I am not new. I don't deserve a man like you." Luke's hand moved from her hand to her face. He cupped her cheek, his thumb brushing away a tear she didn't know had fallen. His touch was rough with calluses, but infinitely gentle. "Mara," he said, his voice fierce and low, "listen to me. Nothing that was done to you makes you less. Those men, they took things, but they didn't take you." He leaned down, his forehead resting against hers. "You are not ruined. You are the strongest thing I have ever known. You kept that baby alive. You walked out of hell with your head up." He pulled back slightly to look into her eyes. The longing in his gaze was naked now, burning bright. "I want you, Mara. I have wanted you since the moment I saw you fighting for your child, but I will never, ever touch you unless you ask me to. I will not be another man who takes." Mara looked at him. She saw the truth in his eyes. He would wait forever. He would sleep in the barn for the rest of his life if she needed him to. She didn't want him to wait. She took his hand from her cheek and kissed the palm, pressing her lips against the rough skin. "I don't want you to be a man who takes," she whispered against his skin. "I want you to be the man I give to." She looked up at him. "Luke, please." It was an invitation, a plea, and a command all at once. Luke let out a sound that was half groan, half prayer. He lowered his head. Their lips met. It wasn't like the kisses in the stories. It was tentative at first, a question asked and answered. His lips were soft, tasting of water and salt. He held himself back, terrified of frightening her. But Mara didn't want hesitation. She pressed into him, her hands coming up to grip his wet shoulders. She opened to him, pouring all the loneliness, all the gratitude, all the months of silent longing into the kiss. Luke responded. His arms went around her, pulling her against his wet chest, lifting her slightly off the ground. The kiss deepened, becoming urgent, desperate. It was the collision of two lonely stars finally finding orbit. He pulled away, breathless, his forehead resting against hers. "Are you sure?" he rasped. "Yes," she said, "yes." He scooped her up into his arms. He carried her not to the barn, but into the house, into the back room where the cradle sat in the corner. The room was dim, lit only by the moonlight filtering through the shutters. Luke set her down by the bed. He stood there, waiting, letting her set the pace. Mara reached out and unbuttoned his shirt, sliding it off his arms. Then she turned so he could undo the buttons of her dress. His fingers were clumsy, shaking slightly, but he managed. When they lay down together on the narrow bed, it was not a conquering, it was a conversation. Luke moved slowly. He stopped every time she tensed, his eyes searching hers, waiting for the nod, the sigh, the pull. He explored her body with a reverence that made her want to weep. He touched her scars, the invisible ones, with hands that worshipped. And Mara touched him. She kissed the whip marks on his back. She held his face. She learned the map of him. When the moment came, and they finally joined together, there was no pain, no shame. There was only a profound sense of coming home. The desire that burned between them was fierce. Yes, pushing against the boundaries of their trauma. But it was rooted deep in the soil of trust. Mara cried out softly, not in fear, but in release. For the first time in her life, her body belonged to her, and she was choosing to share it. Afterward, they lay tangled together under the quilt. The wind whistled outside, unchanged, but inside, everything was different. Luke held her against his chest, his arm heavy and protective over her waist. Mara listened to the steady beat of his heart, feeling the rise and fall of his breathing. She was not property. She was not a debt. She was Mara, and she was loved. This night had not erased the past. The scars were still there on both of them, but it had built a bridge over it. They were no longer two broken people surviving alone. They were a we. And as sleep finally overtook them, Mara knew that no matter what the town said, or what Bart and Hale tried to do, this bond was forged in something stronger than iron. The change in the house was not sudden, like a storm breaking, but gradual, like the coming of dawn. It was in the way the air seemed to hold a different weight, lighter and easier to breathe. The frantic, terrified silence that had once filled the space between Mara and Luke was gone, replaced by a quiet, steady hum of connection. It showed in the small things. When Mara passed the coffee pot to Luke in the morning, her fingers would brush against his, lingering for a heartbeat longer than necessary. He no longer pulled away or stiffened. Instead, his hand would turn slightly to cup hers, a silent acknowledgement before he took the cup. When she sat by the fire mending a shirt, He would walk past and let his hand drift over her shoulder, his thumb grazing the nape of her neck, a touch that said, "I see you and I am here." They moved around each other like partners in a dance they were both learning, step by slow step. There was no need for constant words. The rhythm of the ranch, the chores, the meals, the care of the child, bound them together. The baby thrived in this new atmosphere. Her cheeks, once pale and sunken, were now round and flushed with health. She had dark hair that curled when it was humid, and eyes that were beginning to track movement with bright curiosity. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in violent oranges and soft lavenders, Luke sat on the porch step. He had finished mending a bridle and was wiping grease from his hands with a rag. Mara came out, the baby on her hip. Luke looked up. His face, usually so stern, softened instantly. He reached out his hands. "Let me take her," he said. "Your back must be aching." Mara handed the child over without a moment's hesitation. The fear that he would hurt her, or drop her, or look at her with disgust was a distant memory, like a nightmare that fades with the morning light. Luke lifted the baby high into the air, his big hands encompassing her small rib cage. "Hello there, little bird," he rumbled. The baby kicked her legs and let out a sound, a clear, bubbling laugh that seemed to startle the silence of the plains. It was the first time she had laughed. Luke froze, a look of wonder crossing his face. He lowered her slowly until they were nose to nose. "Did you hear that?" he asked Mara, his gray eyes shining. "I heard it," Mara said, smiling, leaning against the porch post. She likes being high up. She likes the view. Luke pulled the baby against his chest, tucking her head under his chin. He rocked her gently. "She needs a name. Mara," he said quietly. "We cannot keep calling her the baby. It is not right. She is a person. She is here." Mara looked out at the darkening fields. She had thought of names 100 times, but none had felt right. They all felt like names from her old life, names that belonged to a girl who was owned. "Grace," she said suddenly. Luke looked at her. "Grace?" "Because we did not deserve this," Mara said, her voice thick. "We did not deserve to find this peace, but we have it. It is a grace." Luke tested the name, whispering it into the baby's hair. "Grace." He looked up at Mara. "It is a good name. Strong, like her mother." Mara felt a flush of heat rise in her cheeks. Not from shame, but from a pride she was just beginning to understand. She walked over and sat beside him on the step, leaning her head on his shoulder. He wrapped his free arm around her, pulling her close. "I am Luke's woman," she thought, the words sounding strange and wonderful in her mind. Not his property, his woman. But even as she settled into the warmth of his side, a cold sliver of ice remained in her gut. It was the old fear, the one that whispered that happiness was a trap, that the world did not allow women like her to keep things like this. Somewhere out there, beyond the fence line, the past was waiting. The past was indeed waiting, and it was drinking whiskey in the Gilded Horn Saloon. Barton Hale slammed his glass down on the bar, the amber liquid sloshing over his hand. The saloon was busy, but the noise seemed to grate on his nerves tonight. "She is playing house," a man next to him muttered. "That is what I heard. Living there like she is his wife." It was Jeb, the ranch hand Luke had thrown into the dirt. He was nursing his bruised pride along with a cheap beer. Barton's jaw tightened. The humiliation of the auction still burned in his gut. He had taken the money. Yes, $150 was a fortune. But the way Luke Carver had looked at him, like he was something scraped off a boot, and the way the town was now whispering about the silent saint and his redeemed whore, made Barton's blood boil. He had expected Carver to use her and discard her. That was the natural order of things. That was how men like them operated. But to hear that she was walking around that ranch with her head held high, that the baby was being paraded around like legitimate kin, it was an insult. It was theft. "She is mine," Barton hissed, staring at his reflection in the mirror behind the bar. That paper was a bill of sale for labor. It did not say he could marry her. It did not say he could take my property and turn it into a lady. You cannot do much about it. Barton, Jeb said, wiping foam from his lip. He paid the gold. Sheriff Miller says it is legal. Legal? Barton spat. Since when does the law matter out here? It matters what a man can hold. And Carver thinks he can hold what belongs to me. He turned to look at the room. He saw men who owed him money. Men who were bored. Men who were mean. And that brat, Barton said, his eyes narrowing. If she is comfortable, it is because of that kid. That is her weakness. You take the calf, you get the cow. He poured another drink, his mind working like a rusty trap snapping shut. He wouldn't just ride out there and demand her back. That would be foolish. Carver was a killer. Everyone knew that. No, he needed to break them first. He needed to squeeze them until they were desperate. He needed to remind Mara that no matter how far she ran, the leash was still in his hand. The land turned against them before Barton did. August bled into September, and the rain simply stopped. The high wispy clouds that promised moisture evaporated before noon, leaving a sky of relentless, blinding blue. The wind, usually a nuisance, became a scourge. It sucked the moisture from the soil, turning the dirt to powder that rose in choking clouds with every step. The creek that ran through the lower pasture, usually a reliable source of water for the stock, dwindled to a trickle, then to a series of muddy puddles. The grass turned brittle and yellow, snapping underfoot like dry bones. Life on the ranch shifted from a rhythm of maintenance to a battle for survival. Luke was up hours before dawn, his face grim. The cattle were growing restless, wandering further and further in search of water. They were losing weight, their ribs showing through their dusty hides. We have to move the herd to the north section, Luke said one morning, shoving dry biscuits into his mouth. There is a spring up in the canyon. It might still be running. Mara nodded, pouring him coffee. She looked tired. The heat made Grace fussy. The baby cried in the afternoons when the temperature inside the cabin climbed. I will help you ride the line, Mara said. We can check the fence while we move them. Luke looked at her, his fork pausing halfway to his mouth. No, he said. Mara frowned. Why not? You cannot move 50 head alone. Luke, not in this heat. They will scatter. It is too hot for you out there, he said, his voice clipped. And it is too rough. I do not want you riding that far. Stay here with Grace. Keep the house cool. Mara felt a prickle of irritation. I can strap Grace to me, or I can leave her in the cradle for a few hours if I come back to nurse. She will be fine. I am not an invalid. Luke, I know how to ride. I said no, Luke said, sharper this time. He stood up, his chair scraping loudly against the wood floor. You are staying here. The command hung in the air, ugly and familiar. Mara stood up too, her hands gripping the edge of the table. Do not speak to me like that, she said, her voice shaking slightly. I am not a child, and I am not your servant. Luke turned, his eyes dark with stress and fatigue. I am trying to keep you safe. Mara, the heat out there kills people. If you fall, if the horse throws you, I cannot be watching the cows and watching you at the same time. Watching me? Mara snapped. Is that what you think you are doing? Watching me like I am another head of cattle? That is not what I meant, Luke shouted. It sounds like what you meant, Mara shouted back. The anger that had been buried under weeks of tenderness erupted. She walked around the table, confronting him. I lived in a saloon. Luke, I survived men who beat me and used me. Do you think a little son is going to kill me? Do you think I am so weak that I need to be locked in this house while you do the work? I am not locking you in, Luke roared, raking a hand through his hair. I am protecting you. Why is that so hard for you to understand? Because men always call it protection, Mara screamed, tears of frustration stinging her eyes. Barton said he was protecting me from the street. My father said he was protecting me when he traded me for a debt. They always decide where I go and what I do, and they call it safety." She jabbed a finger at his chest. "I thought you were different. I thought we were partners. But the moment things get hard, you are just the man who bought the deed again." Luke recoiled as if she had struck him. His face went pale beneath the tan. He looked at her, his mouth opening and closing, the words dying on his tongue. He saw the fear in her eyes, not fear of the drought, but fear of him, fear of his control. He realized with a sickening jolt that she was right. He had been giving orders. He had been making decisions for her, assuming he knew best, assuming his strength was the only thing standing between her and destruction. Luke stammered, I am not Barton." "Then stop acting like him," Mara cried. She turned away, wrapping her arms around herself, shaking. The silence that followed was heavy and suffocating. The only sound was the wind hissing against the logs of the cabin. Luke stood there for a long moment. He wanted to reach out to her. He wanted to pull her into his arms and explain that he was terrified. Terrified that the heat would take her. Terrified that the work would break her. Terrified that if he took his eyes off her for a second, the universe would snatch her away. But he couldn't bridge the gap. His pride and his shame held him rooted to the spot. "Fine," he said, his voice hollow. "Stay or go. Do what you want." He grabbed his hat and stormed out the door, letting it slam shut behind him. Mara flinched at the sound. She sank into a chair, burying her face in her hands. She listened to the sound of his horse galloping away, the hoofbeats fading into the distance. She was right. She knew she was right. But the victory felt like ashes in her mouth. She didn't want to be right. She wanted him to come back. The day dragged on, an endless stretch of heat and silence. Mara did not ride out. She stayed in the house, angry and miserable. She scrubbed the floors until her knuckles were raw. She baked bread, pounding the dough with unnecessary force. When Luke returned at dusk, he was gray with dust and exhaustion. He didn't look at her. He went straight to the pump, washed, and then went to the barn to tend the horses. He didn't come in for supper. Mara sat at the table, the plate of food cold in front of her. She looked at the empty chair. The distance between the house and the barn felt like a canyon. She fed Grace and put her down in the cradle. She lay in the big bed alone, staring at the ceiling. She missed the warmth of him. She missed the sound of his breathing. Is this how it ends? She wondered. Not with a bang, but with a silence that grows until it swallows us. She woke to the smell. It was sharp and acrid, stinging her nose. At first, she thought she had left the stove damp or open, but this wasn't wood smoke from a hearth. It was the smell of dry grass burning. Mara sat up, her heart hammering. "Luke!" she screamed. She scrambled out of bed, grabbing her wrapper. She ran to the window and threw open the shutters. The world outside was glowing. To the south, near the creek bed, a line of orange fire was dancing in the dark. It was small still, but the wind was behind it, pushing it relentlessly toward the house and the barn. Mara ran to the door and threw it open. Luke was already there, running from the barn, a wet sack in his hand. "Fire!" he shouted, his voice hoarse. "Get the buckets! Get everything that holds water!" The anger of the argument evaporated instantly. There was no time for pride. There was only the fire. Mara grabbed 2 metal pails from the porch. She ran to the pump. Her hands shook as she worked the handle, the water splashing over her bare feet. Luke was beating at the flames near the corral fence, trying to stop it from reaching the dry timber. The fire hissed and popped, feeding on the brittle sagebrush. The wind carried sparks like angry fireflies. One landed on Mara's sleeve, burning a tiny hole. She slapped it out without thinking. She ran the buckets to Luke. He grabbed them, dousing the fence posts, the steam hissing up in a white cloud. "It is moving too fast," he yelled over the roar of the wind. "We have to wet the barn roof. If the hay catches, we lose everything." Mara ran back to the pump. Her lungs burned from the smoke. Her eyes watered. She saw Luke climb the ladder to the barn loft. He was a dark silhouette against the orange glow. He was throwing water on the shingles, stomping out embers with his boots. Mara worked like a machine. Pump, run, pass, pump, run, pass. Her muscles screamed. Her wrapper was soaked with water and sweat, clinging to her legs. The fire licked at the corner of the barn. The old wood caught. "Get the horses!" Mara screamed. Luke leaped down from the roof. He threw open the barn doors. The horses were screaming, kicking at their stalls in panic. Luke ran inside. Mara followed him into the smoke-filled cavern. "Get the mare!" Luke coughed, covering his mouth with his arm. "I will get the team!" Mara fumbled with the latch of the mare's stall. The horse reared, eyes rolling white with terror. "Easy!" Mara shouted. "Grabbing the halter, easy, girl!" She dragged the terrified animal out into the yard, slapping its flank to send it running toward the north pasture, away from the flames. Luke came out leading the two heavy draft horses. He released them, and they thundered away into the dark. They turned back to the barn. The corner was fully engulfed now. The heat was intense, searing their skin. "We cannot save the hay!" Luke shouted. "Let it go! Focus on the house!" They retreated to the cabin. They soaked blankets in the horse trough and hung them over the windows. They threw water on the porch. They stood side by side, beating back the creeping line of fire with wet sacks, shoulder to shoulder, fighting for their home. Mara swung the sack until her arms felt like lead. She coughed, spitting out black phlegm. She looked at Luke. His face was streaked with soot, his eyebrows singed. He looked like a demon, or an angel of vengeance. Suddenly, the wind shifted. It turned from the west to the north, blowing the fire back onto itself, back toward the creek where there was no fuel left. The flames faltered. They lowered, starving. Luke dropped his sack. He stood panting, hands on his knees. "It is turning," he gasped. We stopped it." Mara leaned against the porch rail, her legs giving way. She slid down to the ground, gasping for air. She looked out toward the darkness beyond the fire line. The flames were dying down, leaving a blackened scar on the earth. And then she saw it. On the rise of the hill, just at the edge of the firelight, a horseman. He was sitting still, watching them. The orange light glinted off the metal of a bridle. Mara froze. "Luke!" She pointed. Luke spun around. He saw the figure. He reached for his hip, but his gun belt was inside the house. "Hey!" Luke roared, his voice carrying over the dying wind. The figure didn't answer. He simply turned his horse and rode away slowly, disappearing into the blackness of the night. It wasn't lightning. It wasn't an accident. Someone had set the fire. Luke stood watching the spot where the rider had been, his hands curling into fists. "Barton," he whispered, "or one of his men." He turned to Mara. She was sitting in the dirt, shivering violently now that the adrenaline was fading. He rushed to her. He fell to his knees and grabbed her shoulders. "Are you hurt? Are you burned?" Mara shook her head. "I am okay. I am okay. Grace?" "She is inside." Luke said, "The smoke." Mara scrambled up. She ran into the house. The cabin was hazy with smoke, but not thick. Grace was in the cradle. She was coughing, a dry, hacking sound that tore at Mara's heart. Mara snatched her up. She ran back out to the porch, into the fresher air. She held the baby close, listening. The coughing subsided. Grace began to cry, a thin, wailing sound of distress. Mara rocked her, burying her face in the baby's blanket. "She is okay," Luke said, standing beside her. He touched the baby's cheek with a soot-stained finger. "She is okay." Mara looked at the barn. The corner was black and charred. The smell of wet ash was overpowering. "They tried to burn us out," she whispered. "They tried to kill us." Luke looked at the devastation. He looked at the woman and child covered in soot, standing on his porch. He looked defeated. "I cannot protect you," he said, his voice breaking. I tried. I tried so hard. But the fire, the drought, the men. He turned away, leaning his forehead against the blackened post of the porch. You were right, Mara. I am just controlling you, and I am failing at it. You should go. You should take the wagon and go somewhere safe. I bring nothing but ruin. Mara stared at his back. She saw the whip scars under his torn shirt. She saw the man who had fought a wildfire with his bare hands to save a cradle. She handed Grace to him. Luke looked surprised, automatically taking the baby. Mara stepped forward. She grabbed Luke's face with both hands, forcing him to look at her. Her thumbs smeared the soot on his cheeks. You listen to me, Luke Carver, she said fiercely. I am not going anywhere. Luke stared at her, his eyes wide and wet. But I almost got you killed. No, she said, we saved the house. We saved the horses. You and me, together. She pressed her forehead against his. I was wrong today. You are not Barton. You do not want to own me. You want to keep me alive because you love me. She felt him shudder. And I was wrong too, she continued, her voice trembling. I was fighting you because I was scared. I was scared that if I let you lead, I would disappear. But tonight we were one thing. She pulled back to look him in the eye. I love you, Luke. I love you more than I hate them. And I am not leaving. If they want to burn us out, they will have to burn us both. Luke let out a sound like a sob. He pulled her against him, crushing her and the baby between them. I love you, he choked out. God, Mara, I love you. He kissed her. It wasn't gentle. It was desperate. It tasted of smoke and salt and terror. It was a kiss that claimed her, not as property, but as the other half of his soul. Mara kissed him back with equal force. She needed to feel him. She needed to know that they were alive, that their blood was pumping, that the fire hadn't won. Put Grace down, she whispered against his mouth. Luke nodded. He carried the baby inside, laying her in the cradle, which he pulled to the center of the room where the air was clearest. Then he turned to Mara. He didn't wait. He didn't ask. He didn't need to. He crossed the room and swept her into his arms. He kissed her neck, her face, her mouth. He stripped the soot-stained clothes from her body with frantic hands, and she tore at his buttons. They fell onto the bed together. There was no slow exploration tonight. There was no hesitation. It was a collision of bodies driven by the primal need to affirm life in the face of death. Luke moved over her, his weight heavy and grounding. Mara wrapped her legs around him, pulling him deeper, needing to feel him everywhere. I am here, he groaned against her skin. I am here. I know, she cried out, I know. They moved together with a rhythm that matched the storm of their emotions, hard, fast, intense. It was a reclaiming. They were reclaiming their bodies from the exhaustion, from the fear, from the men who watched in the dark. When the release came, it was explosive, leaving them both gasping, slick with sweat, clinging to each other as if the earth were falling away. They lay there in the dark, the smell of smoke still heavy in the air. Luke buried his face in Mara's hair. Mara stroked his back, her fingers tracing the old scars and the new burns from the sparks. We are still here, she whispered into the silence. Luke tightened his arms around her. And we will stay here, he vowed, his voice grim and final. Let Barton come. Let him come. I am done hiding. Mara closed her eyes. She knew the fight wasn't over. In fact, it had just begun. But as she drifted into a restless sleep, held tight in the arms of the silent rancher, she knew one thing for certain. She would never face it alone again. The poison that Barton Hale poured into the ear of Blackwood was slow-acting, but it was thorough. He did not storm through the streets screaming in rage. That was the way of a fool. Instead, he sat in the plush red velvet chair of his office at the Gilded Horn, pouring generous measures of whiskey for the men who mattered, the cattle buyers, the merchants, and the men who sat on the town council. He stole her, Barton would say, his voice low and reasonable, shaking his head with feigned regret. I had a contract with that girl, a labor contract to work off a significant debt. Luke Carver came in here, threw some money on a barrel, and rode off with my property and the inventory she was carrying. He meant the baby. To Barton, Grace was inventory. The lie took root in the fertile soil of the town's prejudice. Men who had always been unsettled by Luke's silence, by his scar, and by the way he looked through them rather than at them, found it easy to believe he was a villain. They whispered that he was depraved, that he had cheated an honest businessman, that he was holding a white woman against her will out there on the desolate plain. It was not about the law, it was about order, and Luke Carver was a disruption to the order. By the time Sheriff Miller rode out to the ranch 3 days later, he was not coming to ask questions. He was coming to settle a grievance. The sheriff brought 2 deputies with him, young men with nervous eyes and hands that hovered too close to their holsters. They rode up the long track to the ranch house just as the sun was hitting its zenith, the heat shimmering off the hard-packed earth. Luke was waiting for them. He stood on the porch, his boots planted wide, his thumbs hooked into his belt. The Winchester rifle leaned against the doorframe, close enough to reach in a heartbeat, far enough to claim he wasn't threatening anyone. Mara stood behind him, in the shadow of the doorway. She held Grace against her shoulder, her hand cupping the back of the baby's head. Her heart beat against her ribs like a trapped bird, but her feet were rooted to the floorboards. She was done hiding. Sheriff Miller reined in his horse 10 yards from the porch. He looked tired. He looked like a man who knew he was doing wrong, but had convinced himself it was necessary. "Morning, Luke," Miller said, touching the brim of his hat. "Sheriff," Luke replied. His voice was flat, offering no welcome. "I have got a paper here." "Luke," Miller said, reaching into his vest pocket and pulling out a folded document. "It is a writ of retrieval. Barton Hale swears out a complaint that you have absconded with contracted property. Specifically, the woman known as Mara and her female child." Luke did not move. "I have a bill of sale," Luke said, "signed by Barton himself. $150. Miller sighed, smoothing the paper on his saddle horn. "Barton says that was a deposit on a lease. Luke, he says the girl owes $500. And since she is under contract, she has to come back to work it off." "It is a lie," Mara said. Her voice rang out clear and sharp across the yard. Miller looked up, surprised. He was used to the cowering girl on the auction block. The woman standing in the doorway wore a clean calico dress, her hair braided back, her chin lifted high. Mara stepped out onto the porch, moving to stand beside Luke. She did not cling to him. She stood on her own. "I owe Barton Hale nothing," she said, her voice trembling with anger. "Not fear. I worked in his kitchen and his saloon for 2 years without a wage. I paid for my room and board 10 times over in sweat and blood. That paper is a lie. Sheriff, it is forged by a man who cannot stand that he lost." Miller shifted uncomfortably in his saddle. "Now, Mara," he said, his tone patronizing, "you do not understand the law. These are business matters." "I understand that he beat me," Mara said, stepping to the edge of the porch. "I understand that he tried to sell my daughter to a skin trapper." "Is that the law, Sheriff? Does the law say a mother and a week-old child are just things to be traded?" One of the deputies, a boy named Caleb with a patchy beard, spat on the ground. "She is just a whore." "Sheriff," Caleb muttered, "and the kid is a mongrel. Why are we talking to them? Let us just grab her." Luke's hand moved. It was a blur of motion. In 1 second, the Winchester was in his hands. The lever cracked, and the barrel leveled at Caleb's chest. The silence that fell over the yard was absolute. The wind stopped. The insects stopped. Even the horses seemed to hold their breath. "Get off my land," Luke said. His voice was not loud. It was a low rumble, like the earth shifting before a quake. "Luke, put it down," Miller said, his hand going to his own revolver but stopping halfway. "You draw on a deputy." and I have to hang you. You know that." "If he takes one step toward this porch," Luke said, his eyes locked on Caleb, "he will not live to see the hanging." Caleb went pale, his hands raising slowly in the air. He looked at the black hole of the rifle barrel and saw his own death waiting there. Sheriff Miller looked at Luke, then at Mara, and finally at the baby sleeping in her arms. He saw the resolve in the rancher's face. He saw a man who had drawn a line in the dirt and was willing to die on it. "We are leaving," Miller said, gathering his reins. "But Sheriff," Caleb protested. "I said we are leaving," Miller barked. He turned his horse, looking back at Luke with a mixture of warning and regret. "This is not over. Luke, Barton has riled up the town. He has got men riding with him who are not wearing badges. If I go back without her, he is going to come himself, and he will not come to talk." "Let him come," Luke said. Miller shook his head and spurred his horse. The three men rode away, a cloud of dust swallowing them as they headed back toward the east. Luke watched them go until they were just specks on the horizon. Only then did he lower the rifle. He let out a long breath, his shoulders sagging slightly. He turned to Mara. He didn't ask if she was okay. He reached out and pulled her and the baby against his chest, holding them with a desperate strength. "They will be back," he whispered into her hair. "Tonight." The sun went down like a bruise, purple and swollen. The night that followed was heavy and moonless. Luke barred the door. He checked the shutters. He loaded the shotgun and placed it by the window. He moved the cradle into the corner of the room, behind the heavy oak table, creating a bunker within the home. "Stay dressed," he told Mara. "Keep your boots on." They sat in the dark, listening, every creak of the house settling. Every rustle of the wind in the sagebrush sounded like a footstep. Midnight passed, then 1 o'clock. "Maybe they are not coming," Mara whispered, though she didn't believe it. Luke was staring out through a crack in the shutter. "Barton is a coward," he murmured. "He will not come at the front door. He will want to flush us out." As if his words were a summons, a flicker of light appeared in the reflection of the window glass. "Fire," Luke said, his voice turning to ice. He threw open the shutter. The stack of hay, the winter feed they had fought so hard to save from the wildfire, was blazing. A torch had been thrown into the center of it. The flames were shooting 30 feet into the air, bright and hungry. "They are going for the barn again," Luke shouted. "The horses!" He grabbed the shotgun. "Stay here," he ordered Mara. "Bar the door behind me. Do not open it for anyone but me." He unlocked the door and sprinted out into the yard, running toward the burning haystack, hoping to cut the fire line before it reached the main structure of the barn where the animals were stabled. Mara rushed to the door to slam the bolt home, but she stopped. Through the roar of the fire, she heard a sound that turned her blood to water. It was the cry of a horse, but it wasn't coming from the barn. It was coming from the back of the house. And then the sound of glass breaking. The bedroom window. "Grace!" Mara screamed. She spun around and ran toward the back room. The door to the bedroom was open. The shutters had been smashed in. A man was climbing out of the window, a dark shape against the night sky. In his arms, he held a bundle. "No!" Mara shrieked, a sound torn from the very bottom of her soul. She lunged across the room, grabbing at the man's leg. He kicked out, his heavy boot catching her in the chest. Mara flew backward, crashing into the washstand. The pitcher shattered, water soaking her dress. She gasped for air, her ribs burning, but she scrambled to her hands and knees. She saw the man vault onto a waiting horse outside the window. She saw the flash of the white blanket in the darkness. "Luke!" she screamed. "Luke! They have her!" She ran out the front door, stumbling into the yard. Luke was halfway to the barn. He heard her scream, a sound of such pure terror that he skidded to a halt. He turned to see Mara running toward him, her face illuminated by the firelight, her arms empty. He did not need to ask. He raised the shotgun and fired blindly into the darkness beyond the house. a roar of defiance that hit nothing but the night. Hoofbeats hammered against the hard earth, fading fast, riding east toward the canyons. Luke ran to Mara. She collapsed into his arms, sobbing, her body convulsing. "They took her. She choked out. They took my baby. Oh God, Luke, they took her." Luke looked at the darkness where the riders had vanished. A cold, deadly calm settled over him. It was the calm of the soldier who has nothing left to lose. He did not speak. He practically carried Mara back to the porch. There, nailed to the door frame with a skinning knife, was a piece of paper. Luke pulled the knife free. He held the paper up to the light of the burning hay. The handwriting was jagged and crude. "She belongs to me. You want the brat? Bring the girl. Box Canyon. Sunrise. Come alone. Any tricks? The kid stays with me." Mara read the words over his shoulder. She stopped crying. The tears simply stopped, replaced by a horror so profound it left no room for grief. "It is me," she whispered. "It is my fault." "No," Luke said, crushing the paper in his fist. "It is," she said, pulling away from him. Her voice was hollow. "I am the poison. Luke, I brought this to your door. If you had never bought me." She looked at him, her eyes wild. I have to go to him." She turned toward the corral, as if she intended to walk to the canyon right then. Luke grabbed her arm. "Stop," he commanded. "Let me go," she screamed, fighting him, hitting his chest with her fists. "He will hurt her. He will kill her to punish me. I have to give him what he wants." Luke wrapped his arms around her, pinning her arms to her sides, holding her tight as she thrashed against him. "Mara, listen to me, listen!" He pressed his face against hers, mingling his sweat with her tears. "If you go to him like this, he will kill you both," he said, his voice rough and urgent. "He does not want to trade. He wants to win. He wants to break us." Mara went limp in his arms, sagging against him. "What do we do?" she sobbed. "What do we do?" "We wait for light," Luke said, "and then we ride together." The hours before dawn were an eternity. They did not go inside. The house felt violated, the empty cradle a gaping wound in the room. They sat on the porch steps, wrapped in the same blanket, watching the embers of the haystack die down to gray ash. The silence of the plains was heavy, pressing in on their ears. Every second that ticked by was a second Grace was alone, cold, perhaps hungry, in the hands of men who saw her as leverage. Mara sat with her head on Luke's shoulder. She felt old. She felt like the girl who had stood on the auction block, powerless and small. "I would die for her, Luke," she whispered into the dark. "I know," he said. "No," Mara said, shifting to look at him. "I mean it. If it comes to it, if he says it is me or her, you let me go. You take her and you ride. You promise me." Luke looked at her. In the starlight, her face was pale, etched with a determination that frightened him. "I am not trading you, Mara," he said. "You might have to," she said. "I would rather die free, knowing she is safe with you, than live 100 years wondering what happened to her, or live back under his boot." She took his hand, her fingers cold. "I am your woman. Luke, I chose you, and because I chose you, I can choose this. If I have to give myself up to save her, I will. And you have to let me." Luke gripped her hand until her bones ground together. He wanted to refuse. He wanted to tell her that he would kill every man in that canyon before he let anyone touch her again. But he was a soldier. He knew that sometimes. The battle demanded a price. "I promise," he said, his voice sounding like it was being torn from his throat. "I promise I will save Grace." "And you will not let him take me alive," Mara added softly. Luke closed his eyes. A single tear tracked through the soot on his face. "I will not let him take you," he vowed. First light was gray and unforgiving. The sun did not rise so much as the darkness simply faded, revealing a landscape of sharp rocks and dry brush that looked like the bones of the earth. They rode out side by side, Luke on his big bay gelding, Mara on the roan mare. They did not speak. There were no words left. Luke wore his gun belt. The Winchester was scabbarded on his saddle. He looked like a reaper, his face set in a mask of stone. Mara rode with her back straight. She wore the coat Luke had given her on the first day, the canvas oversized and heavy. Inside the pocket, her hand was wrapped around a small, pearl-handled revolver, a hideout gun Luke had given her weeks ago. The box canyon was 5 miles east. It was a dead end, a box of sheer red rock walls with only one way in and one way out. A trap. As they rode into the mouth of the canyon, the air grew still. Ravens circled overhead, black specks against the gray sky. Waiting. The whole West seemed to be holding its breath, watching to see if love was strong enough to stand against this kind of cruelty. They rounded the final bend. Barton Hale was waiting. He stood near the back of the canyon, where the rock wall rose 100 feet straight up. He was flanked by 4 men. They were hard men, drifters and hired guns, holding rifles loosely in their hands. And there, at Barton's feet, was a bundle wrapped in a dirty blanket. Grace. She was crying. The sound echoed off the canyon walls, thin and terrified, piercing Mara's heart like a needle. Luke reined in his horse 50 yards away. Mara stopped beside him. Barton smiled. It was a wide, triumphant grin that showed his teeth. "You are punctual." "Carver," Barton called out. "I appreciate that." "Where is the baby?" Luke shouted. "Right here," Barton said, nudging the bundle with the toe of his boot. "She is a loud little thing. Kept the boys awake all night." Mara let out a low sound of distress, gripping her reins. "I brought the girl," Luke said. "Now let the child go." Barton laughed. It was a dry, scratching sound. "Not just yet. I want to see you walk away. Carver, I want to see you get down off that horse, unbuckle that gun belt, and drop it in the dirt. Then you turn around and you walk out of here, alone." "And Mara?" Luke asked. "Mara comes to me," Barton said, his eyes fixing on her with a look of pure, venomous ownership. "She knows where she belongs." Luke looked at Mara. This was the moment. "Do it," Mara whispered. Luke slowly dismounted. He stood by his horse. He unbuckled his heavy gun belt. The holster and the Colt revolver fell to the dust with a heavy thud. He pulled the Winchester from the scabbard and threw it down beside the belt. "There," Luke said, raising his empty hands. "Now give her the baby." Barton nodded to Mara. "Come here, girl. Come get your bastard." Mara slid down from the mare. Her legs felt heavy, but she did not stumble. She wrapped the coat tighter around herself. She began to walk. Every step was a mile. The distance between Luke and Barton felt like the distance between heaven and hell. She could feel the eyes of the gunmen on her. She could hear Grace crying. She kept her eyes locked on the child. "I am coming. Grace, Mama is coming." She could feel Luke's gaze on her back. It was a physical weight, a shield of love and desperation. She knew that even unarmed. He was coiled like a spring, waiting for one mistake, one opening. She reached the halfway point, 25 yards from Luke, 25 yards from Barton. Barton stepped forward. He looked victorious. He looked like a man who had reclaimed his property and crushed his enemy. "That is close enough," Barton said. He reached down and grabbed the bundle of blankets by the knot. He lifted Grace up, dangling her carelessly in the air. The baby shrieked. One of the gunmen, a man with a long duster coat standing to Barton's left, shifted his feet. He looked at the crying baby. Then at Barton. He looked uneasy. "Put her down, Barton," the gunman muttered. "We got the girl. Do not hold the kid like that." "Shut up, Pete," Barton snapped, not looking at him. He looked at Mara. "On your knees, Mara," Barton commanded. "Crawl the rest of the way. Beg me to take you back." Mara stopped. She looked at the man who had owned her for 2 years. She looked at the cruelty etched into his face. "No," she said. Barton's face reddened. "What did you say?" "I said no," Mara said, her voice rising, echoing off the rocks. "I am not crawling, and I am not yours." Barton sneered. "You are whatever I say you are." He shook the baby violently. "I will drop her. Mara, I will drop her right on these rocks." The gunman named Pete stepped forward. "That is enough. Hail!" Barton spun on him. "I am paying you to hold a gun, not to give advice." The distraction was split-second. The baby was swinging in the air. The men were looking at Barton. Pete, the gunman, looked at the baby. He had a child of his own back in Abilene. He had signed on to scare a rancher, not to murder an infant. A line was crossed. Pete raised his rifle, not at Luke, at Barton. "Let the kid go!" Pete yelled. Barton panicked. He saw the betrayal in his own ranks. His control shattered. He went for his pistol with his free hand, dropping the baby. Grace fell. Mara screamed and lunged forward. A gunshot rang out. It was loud, deafening in the enclosed space. Barton jerked, his shoulder exploding in a spray of red. But it wasn't Luke who had fired. It was Pete. The canyon erupted into chaos. The other three gunmen, confused by the infighting, hesitated. And in that moment of hesitation, the silence of the West was broken by the roar of war. The shot that rang out from Pete's rifle was not the end of the violence. It was the spark that ignited the powder keg. Barton Hale staggered back, clutching his shoulder, his face a mask of shock. The pistol in his hand wavered, and the bundle of blankets, the child, Grace, slipped from his grasp. She fell. Time seemed to warp and stretch, slowing down to a crawl. Mara screamed, a sound that tore her throat raw, but her body was already moving. She did not think about the guns. She did not think about the men. She saw only her daughter tumbling toward the hard, unforgiving earth of the canyon floor. Luke moved in the same heartbeat. He did not run toward the baby. He knew Mara was closer. He dove for the weapons he had dropped in the dust. He hit the ground hard, his hand closing around the cold steel of the Winchester lever action. He rolled onto his back, working the lever with a metallic clack-clack that sounded like the judgment of God. The gunman who had been standing next to Barton, a man named Silas who had laughed when Grace cried, was raising his rifle to shoot Mara. Luke didn't aim. He simply pointed and fired. The Winchester roared. Silas crumpled, his chest shattering, his weapon falling uselessly to the stones. Grace hit the dust. She rolled once, her wail cut off by the impact, then started again, louder and more terrified than before. Mara threw herself over the child. She curled her body into a ball, shielding the tiny life beneath her with her own flesh and bone, offering her back to the bullets. "Get down!" Pete screamed, scrambling for cover behind a cluster of sagebrush as the remaining two gunmen opened fire. The canyon turned into a slaughterhouse. The noise was deafening, amplified by the sheer rock walls until it felt like the thunder of the apocalypse. Bullets whined and ricocheted off the stone, sending sprays of granite shrapnel into the air. The horses, panicked by the noise and the smell of blood, reared and broke their reins, stampeding toward the canyon mouth. Luke scrambled to his feet, firing as he moved. He was not the rancher now. He was not the quiet man who fixed fences and drank coffee on the porch. He was the soldier who had survived the worst hell the war could offer. He moved with a cold, terrifying fluidity, his face emptied of all emotion save for a singular, deadly focus. He took cover behind a fallen slab of sandstone. Bullets chipped away the rock inches from his face, dusting him with red powder. He didn't flinch. He waited for the rhythm, for the pause in the firing. There. He popped up, fired once, and ducked back down. One of Barton's men, hiding behind a dead mesquite bush, spun around and fell face first into the dirt. 2 down, plus the traitor, Pete. That left 1 gunman in Barton. Mara lay in the dirt, the taste of copper and dust in her mouth. She could feel Grace squirming beneath her, alive and warm. "Stay still," she whispered frantically into the dirt. "Stay still, baby." She lifted her head an inch. Through the haze of gun smoke, she saw movement to her left. The last gunman, he was circling wide, moving through the brush, trying to flank Luke's position behind the sandstone. He had a shotgun. If he got around that rock, he would cut Luke in half. Luke was focused forward, watching Barton. He didn't see the man creeping up on his blind side. Mara looked around wildly. Her eyes landed on the dirt a few feet away. The pearl-handled revolver. It had fallen from her pocket when she dove for Grace. She reached out, her fingers scrabbling in the grit. She grabbed the cold metal grip. It felt heavy in her hand, heavier than it had during the lessons behind the barn. She remembered Luke's voice, low and steady in her ear. "Do not pull. Squeeze. Let the wood become part of your bone." She sat up. She was exposed. She didn't care. She leveled the revolver at the man creeping toward Luke. Her hand was shaking so hard she thought she might drop the gun. The man was 30 feet away. He raised his shotgun. Sensing her movement, turning toward her, Mara took a breath. She held it. She forced her hand to still. She squeezed. The revolver kicked in her hand, the recoil jarring her shoulder. The shot went wide, hitting the gunman in the hip rather than the chest. But it was enough. The man screamed, his leg buckling. His shotgun blast went wild, tearing into the sky. Luke spun around at the sound. He saw Mara holding the smoking gun. He saw the wounded man trying to raise his weapon again. Luke didn't hesitate. He put a bullet through the man's heart before he could pull the trigger a second time. Silence slammed back into the canyon, heavy and ringing. Luke looked at Mara. His eyes were wide, filled with a mixture of terror and fierce pride. He nodded once, a sharp jerk of his chin. Then he turned back to the end of the canyon. "Barton!" Luke roared. There was no answer. Just the sound of the wind hissing through the rocks and the groans of the dying men. Luke reloaded the Winchester as he walked forward. He moved past the bodies without looking down. He stepped over the rocks, his boots crunching on the gravel. Barton Hale was trying to climb. He had scrambled up a scree slope toward a narrow ledge, dragging his wounded leg behind him, leaving a smear of bright red blood on the gray stones. He was panicked, thrashing like a trapped rat. He reached the ledge and turned, trying to bring his pistol to bear. Luke stopped at the bottom of the slope. He raised the rifle. "Drop it," Luke commanded. Barton's hand shook. He looked at the rifle pointed at his chest. He looked at the bodies of his hired men scattered in the dust. He let the pistol clatter to the stone ledge. "It is over, Barton," Luke said, his voice flat. Barton laughed, but it was a wet, bubbling sound. He clutched his shoulder, leaning back against the canyon wall. "Over? You think this is over, Carver?" Barton spat blood onto the rocks below. "You can kill me. Hell, you probably will. But you cannot kill what I know. You cannot kill what this town knows." He pointed a shaking finger toward Mara, who was slowly standing up, clutching Grace to her chest. "Look at her! She is filth! She is a saloon whore I bought for a debt! And that brat is a bastard born in sin!" Barton's eyes were wild, manic with hate. "You can play house all you want. Carver, you can dress her up in calico. But every time you walk down that street, people will know. They will know you are living with my leavings. They will know you are raising a child that has no name." Luke lowered the rifle slightly. He looked at Barton with a strange expression. It wasn't anger anymore. It was pity. "You are wrong," Luke said quietly. He looked back at Mara. She was dusty, her dress torn, her hair wild. She was holding the baby with a fierceness that made her look like a queen of the plains. "She is not filth," Luke said, turning back to Barton. "And that child is not a bastard." Luke took a step forward. "That is my family, Barton, and I know exactly who they are. They are the only clean things in this whole damn territory." Barton's face twisted. The truth of Luke's words, the absolute, unshakable conviction in them, stung him more than the bullet had. He couldn't stand it. He couldn't stand that the man of power, was dying alone in the dirt, while the man he despised stood tall. "I will take you all with me," Barton screamed. He reached into his boot. He pulled out a hidden derringer, a small, deadly holdout weapon. He raised it fast. Luke didn't blink. He didn't dive. He simply fired. The Winchester barked one last time. The bullet caught Barton square in the chest. He was thrown back against the rock wall. He slid down, leaving a dark streak on the stone. He hit the ledge and lay still, his eyes staring up at the patch of gray sky, seeing nothing. He was just a body now, just another piece of the West's long, bloody history, destined to be buried and forgotten under the red dust. Luke stood there for a long moment, the rifle smoking in his hands. The adrenaline began to fade, leaving his knees weak. "Luke!" Mara ran to him. She didn't care about the blood. She didn't care about the bodies. She slammed into him, burying her face in his chest, sobbing. "I got him," she wept. "I got him. I saved you." Luke dropped the rifle and wrapped his arms around her, crushing her and the baby against him. He buried his face in her hair, breathing in the scent of smoke and life. "You did," he whispered, his voice cracking. "You saved me, Mara. You saved us all." Grace began to cry again, a loud, indignant wail. It was the best sound Luke had ever heard. "We are okay," Luke said, rocking them both. "We are okay." Movement at the mouth of the canyon made Luke stiffen. He reached for his revolver, but stopped. It was Sheriff Miller. The lawman rode in slowly, followed by 3 men from town, the blacksmith and 2 ranchers who had never liked Barton's methods. They had followed the tracks, uneasy about the fire and the kidnapping. Miller pulled his horse up short when he saw the carnage. He looked at the bodies of the hired guns. He looked at Barton Hale dead on the ledge. He looked at Pete, who was sitting against a rock, nursing a shoulder wound, his rifle on the ground. And then he looked at Luke and Mara. He saw the way they clung to each other. He saw the baby alive in Mara's arms. He saw the fierce, unyielding look in Luke Carver's eyes. Miller took off his hat and wiped his brow. He looked up at Barton's body. "Is he dead?" Miller asked. "He is," Luke said. Miller nodded slowly. He looked at Pete. "He dropped the baby?" Miller asked the wounded gunman. "He did," Pete grunted. "Hale used the kid as a shield. I could not let that stand." Miller let out a long breath. He looked back at Luke. "Then it was self-defense," Miller said loudly, so the men with him could hear, "and defense of a child." He reached into his saddlebag and pulled out the paper, the writ of retrieval Barton had forced him to carry. He crumpled it up in his fist. "This paper is void," Miller said. "The debt is canceled." He looked at Mara. "You are a free woman, ma'am, and that child is under the protection of the county. Anyone touches them again answers to me." Mara looked at the sheriff. She didn't thank him. He had come too late for thanks, but she nodded, accepting the justice for what it was. Slow, imperfect, but finally real. "We are going home," Luke said. He helped Mara onto the mare. He mounted his own horse. They rode past the sheriff and his posse without looking back, leaving the canyon to the carrion birds and the law. The ride back to town was slow. The horses were tired, and the adrenaline had crashed, leaving a bone-deep exhaustion. But as the buildings of Blackwood appeared on the horizon, Mara sat up straighter. "We are not going around," she said. Luke looked at her. "We can take the back trail. We do not have to see them." "Yes, we do," Mara said. Her face was streaked with dirt and tears, but her eyes were clear. "I want them to see us. I want them to see that we are still standing." Luke studied her for a moment, then nodded. He turned his horse toward Main Street. They rode in at noon. The town was waking up to the news. The sheriff's posse had likely sent a rider ahead. People came out of the stores and the houses. They stood on the boardwalks, watching. There was whispering, of course. "He killed Barton Hale. Look at the blood on his coat. Is the baby alive?" But as Luke and Mara rode down the center of the street, the whispering died down. People saw the way Luke rode, head high, protective, unashamed. They saw Mara, not the cowering girl on the auction block, but a woman who had ridden into hell and come back with her child. Some of the women, the ones who had pulled their skirts away before, looked at the baby in Mara's arms. They saw the way Mara kissed the child's dusty forehead. They remembered their own fears, their own children, and in the silence, a shift happened. The judgment cracked, replaced by a grudging, silent respect. Luke pulled up in front of the Gilded Horn Saloon, the very spot where the auction had happened. He didn't get down, he just sat there, letting the town look at him. Mara shifted Grace to one arm. She looked at the crowd. She saw the faces of men who had bid on her. She saw the faces of women who had called her a whore. She spoke. Her voice was not loud, but in the hush of the street, it carried to every ear. "My name is Mara," she said. She looked directly at the crowd. "I am not a debt. I am not a thing to be sold. I belong to myself, and no one, no man, no bank, no saloon will ever own me again." She turned to Luke. She reached out and took his large, scarred hand in hers. She squeezed it, feeling the warmth, the strength, the promise. "And this man," she said, looking back at the town, her voice ringing with pride, "this man did not buy me. I chose him." She squeezed Luke's hand harder. "And he chose me." Luke looked at her, and for the first time in years, in front of the whole town, he smiled. It was a small, tired smile, but it transformed his face, making him look younger, lighter. "Let us go home," he said. They turned their horses and rode out of Blackwood. They left the whispers behind. They left the judgment behind. They rode west, toward the mountains, toward the ranch that waited for them in the sea of grass. The scars on the land healed, as they always did. The rains returned in October, washing away the ash of the wildfire. The grass pushed up through the blackened earth, greener and stronger than before, fed by the carbon of the burning. The scars on the people healed slower, but they healed. Luke and Mara rebuilt the barn. It took all winter. They worked side by side, fitting the boards, hammering the nails. Luke taught Mara how to plane the wood. Mara taught Luke how to laugh while they worked. There were nightmares, of course. Nights when Mara would wake up screaming, reaching for a baby she thought was gone. Nights when Luke would prowl the house with a shotgun, haunted by the memory of the fire. But they had each other. They would hold each other in the dark, whispering assurances until the sun came up. The ranch changed. It was no longer a fortress of solitude. It became a beacon. It started with a girl named Sarah, who had run away from a brutal husband in Abilene. She was found wandering the road, half-starved. Mara took her in. She fed her, gave her a bed, and let her rest. Then came another, a widow who had lost her farm, a girl who had been cast out by her family. Luke didn't complain. He built a bunkhouse. He realized that his promise to never be a man who breaks things had evolved. Now, he was a man who built a place where broken things could mend. Mara became the heart of the valley. She was no longer the fallen woman. She was the woman you went to when you were in trouble. She was the woman who understood pain and didn't judge it. And Luke was the quiet strength behind her. He watched her with a reverence that never faded. He watched her teach Grace to walk. He watched her direct the ranch hands. He watched her bloom. 2 years later, it was late autumn. The cottonwood trees along the creek had turned a brilliant, shimmering gold. The air was crisp, smelling of wood smoke and dried hay. Luke sat on the porch steps. The wood was warm from the sun. Grace was 2 years old now. She was a whirlwind of energy, running through the yard chasing a calico cat, her laughter bright and fearless. She had Luke's gray eyes and Mara's determined chin. Mara came out of the house. She was carrying a tray with 2 cups of coffee. She moved a little slower these days. She sat down beside Luke, handing him a cup. She leaned back against the post, resting her hand on the distinct swell of her belly. She was tired, but it was a good tired. Luke reached out and placed his hand over hers on her stomach. "He is kicking today," Mara said, smiling. "He?" Luke asked, raising an eyebrow. "You were sure it was a girl yesterday." "Today he feels stubborn," Mara laughed. "Like his father, so it must be a boy." Luke chuckled. He leaned over and kissed her temple. "Boy or girl," he said softly, "they will be free." Mara looked out at the horizon. The sun was sinking, painting the vast western sky in streaks of fire and violet. The mountains stood purple and majestic in the distance. It was the same land that had tried to kill them. It was the same harsh, unforgiving wind, but it didn't look scary anymore. It looked like home. She looked at Grace running in the grass. She looked at the sturdy barn they had built with their own hands. She looked at the man beside her, the silent rancher who had paid a price no one else dared, and who had given her everything by asking for nothing. "We made it! Luke!" she whispered. Luke wrapped his arm around her, pulling her close as the first star appeared in the darkening sky. "Yes," he said, his voice thick with a love that had survived fire and bullets and the cruelty of men. "We made it." They sat there together, watching the night come, not as a threat, but as a rest. The West was still wild, but they were no longer lost in it. They had carved out a space where love could grow, stubborn and beautiful, in the dust. Thank you so much for listening to the story of Mara and Luke. It has been a journey through the dust and the fire, and I hope their fight for love and freedom touched your heart as much as it did mine while writing it. I would love to know where you are listening from today. Please leave a comment below and tell me which part of the world you call home. And if you enjoyed this story, please consider subscribing to From Wild West for more tales of the frontier, where hope and hardship go hand in hand. Share your thoughts in English in the comments. What did you think of Mara's choice at the end? I read every one. Until the next time, keep your eyes on the horizon.